As the man in the cloak walked forward, corpses of people he had killed along the way appeared around him. The man, lying on the ground, asked the approaching man in horror who he was and why he was doing this. The man in the cloak chuckled, repeating the man's question about who he was. He replied that he was evil, just like them. He used his black hole skill, and hands emerged from the ground, dragging the corpses underground. Present time. A luxurious room in the mansion of a clearly wealthy family. Someone slowly opened their eyes, looking at the ceiling. An antique telephone and a lamp stood on the nightstand. The door to the room opened slightly. The woman, standing by the baby's crib, greeted the returning gentleman and introduced him to his son. While the woman smiled, he approached the crib. The man, looking down, said that he was finally able to meet him. He took the baby in his arms, saying that, nevertheless, for a baby, even such magical power was too much, a terrifying guy. There were no questions about his skills as a future leader, and his compatibility with the magic of the House of Ark was also in order. But from now on, his life would be filled with more than just joy. He decided to name this child Absolute, and told him to listen, advising him to live by his honor and his own path. Sometime later, the hero was dueling the knight with swords, and shouts of encouragement to Lord Absolute came from the sidelines. The hero shouted at the knight to repeat the battle. The hero's name is Ark Absolute, and he is a reincarnated being. 10 years ago, he opened his eyes, and an unfamiliar ceiling unfolded before him. Then he heard a man's name and became utterly confused. Somehow this world turned out to be the same as the one in the novel The History of the State of Reincarnation, which he had once read. It was his favorite book. And at the same time, he realized he was the power broker behind the scenes, controlling an underground organization based in Reincarnation and Duke Ark Absolute, who had brought harm to many of the country's inhabitants. However, the main problem lies in the story's ending. Ark Absolute, into whom he was reincarnated, will be killed by the story's protagonist, Alt. The reason for his defeat is simply that he had no allies. He had the power to control the kingdom's underground organization, but its part, under the auspices of the aristocracy, betrayed him in favor of the hero's camp, and as the situation worsened, he increasingly diverged from other people. As a result, during the battle with the hero, he was completely alone, and his fate was to be defeated by a hero with overwhelming influence. If the story continues in this vein, he will be killed, and that's the only thing he doesn't want to admit. He had two options. The first was to reform and get along with the protagonist. The second was to defeat the protagonist as the antagonist. He definitely chose the second option, even though he liked the protagonist's romance and couldn't stand it. He decided that since he was born a villain, he would become a villain, just like in the original story, but he would not lose. Before the main events begin, he will eliminate all factors that cause anxiety and be fully prepared. He rushed forward, attacking his opponent in sparring. He decided that, as the ultimate villain, he would wipe out the protagonist. When he struck, the knights' mouths dropped open in shock. The tip of a sword gleamed at his opponent's throat, and he, in full port, acknowledged his defeat before Ark. The hero thought his plan would begin with recruiting loyal allies. Knights ran to him, saying that victory in the battle was already expected from the Lord Absolute. The hero replied with a stern expression that it was obvious. The knights shuddered in fear. He cursed silently. He's had a lot of trouble with this absolute evil skill. It's a skill with development potential that gives you strength based on how much you're hated. But the hero can also become stronger thanks to this skill. The hero apologized to the knights, saying he'd gotten a little carried away. The knights asked him not to apologize. One of them said that he treated Mr. Absolute with awe and respect, and the second confirmed his words. The knight the hero had fought approached them and called out to Lord Absolute, saying he had demonstrated his fencing skills again. The final thrust had been flawless. The hero reflected on how, having practiced a technique once, he appropriated its unusual sensation. In addition to his vast magical power, his skills also include the power of consistently casting high-level spells. He excels in close combat with a blade, and uses healing magic to heal himself from wounds. He also possesses the potential to develop a skill called Absolute Evil. He's practically omnipotent, a completely cheating character. The hero thought to himself that things had gotten more interesting. If he hardened himself with training and increased the number of his comrades before the story began, it would be wonderful. A knight ran toward him from the side, calling out to him. He was told that Mr. Villain was calling him. A little later, in his father's office, Willen said he'd heard reports of his diligent studies and rigorous training. Willen Ark, the current head of the Ark clan, said that this was expected of the next head of the Ark clan, and that from now on the hero must not forget to study diligently. The hero's father, Willen Ark, serves as the head of the kingdom's underground organization. At first, the hero thought he was a terrible man, but in his dealings with the Absolute, he was an honest father. When the hero was shown the process of torturing an enemy, he froze in place. Absolute thanked his father, saying he would continue to give his all. He thought it seemed like his father hadn't praised him in a while, and he was even a little pleased. Willen replied that they would then leave the introduction and move on to the main topic. He explained that a reception in honor of Prince Michael's 10th birthday would be held next month. It was being organized by the royal family, and this time many of his peers would be there, and Absolute was expected to attend as well. Upon hearing about Prince Michael, the hero felt as if he had sided with the protagonist in the story. The leader said he really didn't want to say it, but the hero's skill could easily lead to misunderstandings, so he should behave well at the reception. The hero agreed and asked if the conditions had ended, and if so, he would return to his training. After his son left, the leader smiled, wondering if he'd even considered the pressure, and not responded with his own glare. Shei, the butler and, by extension, a member of the reconnaissance team, said he was receiving reports that the hero's level was currently above 40. He found this suspicious, and likely already exceeded that level. Willen added that by the time the Absolute inherited his position, he would likely have achieved a high position of power in the kingdom, and it wouldn't be a problem if he forcibly suppressed the organization and forced them to follow him. It was the same way in his time. The butler reminded them that this was the reason they followed him, but he had no good reputation whatsoever. The leader merely replied that this was the Ark family's nature. Willen believed that the most important thing was unambiguous power, understandable to everyone who looked. In other words, violence comes second, and a good reputation is irrelevant. The butler merely sighed at this. Shai said that in any case, in order to earn the loyalty of the aristocratic subjects, it was necessary to improve the impression of Mr. Absolute. If this was not done, then there was a possibility that their group would disintegrate in the near future. Sometime later. The capital. The royal castle. Many aristocrats were in the hall. The hero's father greeted His Royal Majesty and His Highness Mikhail. He congratulated them on this wonderful day. The king thanked the Duke of Ark and saw the child nearby. The hero said they were meeting for the first time and introduced himself to the king as Absolute Ark. The king had already heard of him. The prince and the hero's gaze met, and the prince turned away with a displeased face. The hero froze at this. Vian called his son, saying it was time for them to go. A groan came from their direction, and they turned around. Count Jose approached them, and the leader asked how he was doing. The man replied that he was fine thanks to them. The hero thought that loyal aristocrats were also a headache. The Ark family belonged to the high nobility, even though they had no work. Count Jose said he'd heard the Duke's son was present today and wanted to ask his permission to introduce his son. He nudged the boy forward while the hero watched. The Absolute asked him first what his name was. The child replied that his name was Chris Jose, of the Count's Jose family. The hero introduced himself in response, and they exchanged pleasantries. The hero reflected on the hostility even felt by the aristocracy, which made him fear for the future. However, he has no choice but to start a conversation directly. The hero believed that this was the first way to prevent his collapse. The head turned to the Absolute, saying that he had probably already greeted most of those present, and that the adult's room was further on, so he should go to the hall opposite and be there. The hero entered the indicated hall. All the children around him froze, experiencing varying emotions at his appearance. He heard the whispers and judgment around him, and he began to get angry. Everyone around started to run away from him. He heard a scream from the side. Someone was saying that their clans were connected to an underground organization and had the courage to show up at the celebratory event. The hero caught the scream. A group of children sat on the floor. One was even beaten, while others loomed over them, shouting at them to get lost right now. The hero recalled the loneliness of the Absolute in the book, and understood why this had happened. One of the attackers swung his arm, intending to hit Chris, shouting that if they didn't leave, the attack would degenerate into scum. Chris closed his eyes, bracing himself for the blow. Everyone heard a voice asking the attacker what he was doing. Everyone froze in horror and turned to see the Absolute. Chris watched as the hero walked towards them and said in a menacing voice that he would ask again if there was no answer. He stood in front of the guys, covering them, and asked what he was doing with the subjects of the Ark family aristocracy. He noted that it seemed that among them there was also a victim of violence. Ark decided to listen to the reason and looked at the offenders, saying that he would forgive them depending on the answer. He saw before him only small fry, intoxicated by the power of their majority, and they dared to go so far it was disgusting. Ark said that raising a hand against an Ark supporter is the same as starting a fight with the Ark clan itself, isn't that right? He said with a menacing expression that he remembered their faces and that they should lather their necks and wait. The children ran away in fear. When the hall was empty, Absolute turned to the victims. They were trembling, still sitting on the floor. The hero remembered he'd forgotten to deactivate the skill and used cancel. Chris bowed to him, kneeling, and thanked the hero for saving them. He apologized for bringing shame on the Ark faction. Ark reached out to Chris and he closed his eyes. He placed his hand on his shoulder and a glow appeared. The child was surprised. The hero remembered that the child in front of him was Chris from the Count's clan Jose, and said that he looked terrible. Chris apologized again for forcing him to witness such an indecent spectacle from their opponent. There were so many high-ranking nobles, and they were unable to fight back, which ultimately led to the conflict escalating. Chris said he bore full responsibility and asked for forgiveness for the rest. The girl behind them stood up, bowed, and apologized for interrupting. She introduced herself as Lady Claire, of the line of Viscount Claire. She said that Mr. Chris had stood up for her and had been injured, for which she was responsible. She asked him to at least ask Mr. Chris. The hero didn't understand what was happening. The hero wondered if Chris was perhaps more popular than he was. It wasn't that he was jealous or anything. Ark replied that he understood them, but in this case it was not only Chris alone who was involved, or only they, it was their common mistake, and asked if they understood why. Absolute asked Chris to respond to everyone's faces. He replied that, so to speak, they had been underestimated as opponents because they were of low nobility. Ark must have realized from the start that they had a poor public image. The hero asked why they had gathered in this place. Absolute said they probably understood there were no representatives of the upper aristocracy among them, and that they would become targets for others. Chris lowered his head, feeling tears welling up. Chris shouted, asking what they should do then. Ark asked why they hadn't waited for him. The children were surprised. Ark said the current incident occurred because they were low-ranking, while their opponent was high-ranking. If he were here, it would seem he wouldn't have been able to arouse their sympathy. He thought that this time their opponents were the ones to blame the most, and he had not yet finished greeting them. They left without waiting, because they were afraid these were also to blame. Ark said that as he said they also bear responsibility. So he decided to punish them. This seriously scared the children. The hero shouted that from now on, at such events or during studies, they must be in his field of vision. This would be their punishment. He thought that being around him was probably unpleasant, but they had to endure it. There was also a possibility that he would be betrayed by those he couldn't protect. Chris burst into tears, calling out to Lord Ark. The hero said not to misunderstand him. It was all for the sake of the Ark House. At least they had to protect him. Finally, he said that next time they should not leave his side without permission. That was the duty of a ruler. The children called out to him with admiration. Ark demonstrated his abilities by saying that this is how you can combine water magic. With wind magic, Claire's magic is water and wind, and a lot can be done with them. He passed the element he'd created to Claire, and she was surprised that, in addition to magical power, he also possessed such control. Chris also found it astonishing. She admiringly said that this was to be expected from Mr. Absolute, and he replied that it was a given. The girl, inspired, decided to practice right then and there. Ark asked Chris if he possessed fire magic, and he confirmed it, adding that fusion magic and the like were difficult for him. The hero said that fire magic can be used in different ways depending on one's level of training, and that one should focus on developing one's strengths. Chris took his advice. After Prince Michael's birthday party, Chris and the ladies began to make amends for their past mistakes by organizing such training sessions and tea parties. The hero began to feel the gap between them narrowing. Chris hesitantly called out to the hero. Chris wanted to ask him about the magic he'd used to help him at the reception, and the hero explained that it was healing magic. Chris already knew this, but he was still surprised. Chris had heard that the hero was quite skilled in magic and swordsmanship, but for him to be so at such a young age was truly astonishing. The maids approached the boys and called the young masters. They asked the children if they wanted to take a short break. Later, sitting down at the table to have a snack, Lady Claire said that she was stunned by the fact that, in addition to the 4 elements of fire, water, earth, and wind, it was amazing that the hero also possessed healing with dark magic. The girl spoke admiringly of her respect for him. The hero remarked that the lady was the kind of woman who awakens a man's protective instincts. The hero said that simply having useful spells on you is not such a big deal. In battle, something else plays a key role. Unique magic is a hereditary power that can only be used by people of a certain lineage. The conditions are that a person aged 15 or older must be recognized as the heir. No matter how talented they are, they will be unable to use the power. Chris clarified that the Ark clan's unique magic is summoning, isn't it? Ake confirmed this and explained that it allows the summoning of spirits, even more unusual ones, namely those from among the 12 high-level spirits known as the Spirit King clan. In the original story, this magic was so powerful that it could wipe out up to 40% of the enslavement squad. The boy thought, above all, that she wouldn't betray him. Absolute confidently stated that he wanted to inherit it in the future. Claire commented on how amazing it was while Chris froze. 5 years remained until the inheritance. In other words, there are still 5 years until the first event in the original story, school entrance. The hero thought he wouldn't have any supervision during his preparation. The hero called Chris and said that he wanted the maid to be prepared by the time he went to school. He wanted to choose and train a servant from his place, and asked if he could talk about this with Count Jose. Chris replied that it was possible, but asked if he could ask if it wouldn't be faster to choose one of the Ark family servants. The hero replied that he didn't like the people in this house. The children were surprised, and the hero wondered if they suspected anything. Since everyone had defected in the original story, he needed someone who would definitely not betray him. A servant wouldn't betray his master, and he didn't want to give the protagonist a single chance. The hero remembered that she was an old woman who wore a maid's uniform when he was born, but she died 3 years ago. Now this old woman's daughter, MIT, has been caring for him for 48 years. But the current Ark family's mansion looks like a mature maid cafe, and it's simply outrageous. Chris understood and promised to train high-class servants and asked if there were any requirements. The hero replied that race did not matter, but let them have knowledge of self-defense. Claire raised her hand and asked about her candidacy, and the hero replied that it wasn't worth it, which upset her. Chris replied that he understood and would arrange everything. Jose promised to contact the hero as soon as they had everything ready, and the hero stood up from the table and replied that he was counting on him. The hero called out to the maid MIT, who was standing to the side. With trembling hands, they threw a blanket over the boy's shoulders and, together with the hero, left the children. Chris and Claire watched them leave. The girl remarked that even the family servants feared Mr. Absolute, and it would probably be the same at the academy. Chris replied that he hadn't been paying enough attention. The girl felt sorry for the hero and wanted to console him. Chris asked Claire why she was acting like that, whether that was her personality. She replied that it was because Mr. Absolute wasn't such an inflexible man. She knows it's best to maintain this behavior if she wants to get closer to him. Besides, even though he seemed irritated, he didn't reject her. Chris asked if that impression of being in love was just a sham. The girl replied that no, it was pure love. She, like him, did not understand Mr. Absolute, and in the end left him alone, and at that reception he helped them. Claire clarified that Chris must have already been told about the absolute evil skill when she heard this story, and her chest tightened. Then she thought that if Mr. Absolute thought that in the future he might be left alone again, this time she definitely wanted to be there. Moreover, the girl decided that it was better to approach everything with humor, because there was no need to hold back in the presence of others. She wanted the hero to think that she was a person with a big heart. Chris said he felt the same way. He would never abandon Lord Absolute and would fill his entourage with allies. It was his duty to him. The girl agreed, saying that was true. As they were leaving, the boy said he'd done the right thing by approaching Claire first, and she agreed. She excitedly said that, besides, doesn't a handsome high nobleman have a promising future? She should discourage other girls from flirting with him and lay the groundwork for that future. The guy asked if her feelings were truly genuine. Smiling, Jose asked himself whether it wouldn't be better for Mr. Absolute to have many allies. A little later, the hero got out of the carriage, and the butler said he would wait for him there and asked him to be careful. The hero arrived at the house of Count Jose, the mansion of a servant merchant. Inside, the hero was met by the Count, who greeted him and thanked him for his arrival, asking him to be more kind to him today. The Count also said that he had selected many servants at his request, and Chris would accompany the hero, so if he needed anything, he could tell Chris. Regarding the guards, the Count apologized and said they were unnecessary. He invited the hero inside and said they were imposing restrictions on the servants so he could make himself comfortable. The hero decided to clarify and said there was no need to lower the price, as he didn't like being in debt. The Count understood. Smiling, the hero thanked the Count for his hard work, and the man thanked him back with a smile. Entering the room, Chris explained that from now on, he would bring the servants here one by one. Their actions were bound by the contract skill, so they wouldn't cause any problems. He gestured to a chair, asking them to wait. He asked to let him know if anyone was interested in the hero. Sitting down, Absolute realized they had a customized system, as this was his first and last purchase, so he had to choose wisely. It was like buying a house. Thanking them for waiting, Chris brought in the first servant. A girl with animal ears appeared before him. The girl, crying, introduced herself as Vol, from the wolf tribe, and 8 years old. She asked him to choose her. Chris said that he would now begin to bring the servants one by one, and asked to let the hero know if anyone interested him. A girl named Vol said that she was from the wolf tribe and that she was 8 years old, and she asked to be taken with him, which surprised the hero. The hero thought that she looked like she was about to burst into tears. It was unpleasant to encounter such a reaction every time, and yet even Chris's reaction made him surprised. He would get angry at the girl. Absolute asked Chris if Wool was too young to master martial arts. Chris said she was young, but wolves are natural-born wolves, and even as children they are stronger than their peers. He added that she was currently level 18, and considering her potential for development, he recommended taking Vol's mercy and transmutation skills. The hero was impressed, and it would have spared him any surprises. It's best to take servants young. The girl is scared now, but she'll quickly settle in if you treat her well. The hero said that he agreed with Chris, and for some reason the girl began to scream, begging and crying. The hero thought maybe he should have been more careful, and Chris seemed angry with her again. Ultimately, the hero said they'd leave it at that for now, and asked to call the next one. The hero was shocked when he saw the next candidate. The girl introduced herself as Elizabeth, 43, and said that if he took her, she would be nice to the young gentleman. The hero immediately called the next one. The next candidate entered the room. The girl introduced herself as Maria Stella, aged 15. Upon hearing the name, the hero immediately thought he'd heard it somewhere before. Chris explained that Maria was once a noblewoman, but became a servant because she couldn't pay off a huge debt, but she is a capable knight. He said that she had not yet awakened her magical abilities, and the hero immediately remembered her. Maria Stella is a character from the novel and an older sister type. She's cold at first, but after her release, she becomes attached to the protagonist. That's her essence. There was a moment in the book when the girl asked the hero if he was already exhausted, and that she agreed to lend him her knees, but when he woke up, they would continue training. She giggled, telling the protagonist that he had a cute face. She also helped him wash himself. The hero, embarrassed, criticized such scenes in the book as inappropriate. If he won Maria over to his side, he would undermine the protagonist's power. And once she finished training, Maria would be able to use magic. She had enormous potential. And then the hero made his decision. He informed Chris of his decision. Chris assumed the hero had decided to choose Elizabeth, but the hero thought he was trying to foist her on him. Absolute said he was choosing Maria and Wool and wanted to make a contract. He silently apologized to Chris because Elizabeth could handle it on her own. The hero signed the documents, and the Count announced that everything was in order. The girls stood aside. Vol was trembling, and Maria was clearly angry. He told the girls that from now on he was their master, and that they would both serve him as maids. Wool screamed that they said the hero was one of the kingdom's most feared villains. Upon learning that the hero was from the Ark clan, Maria became even more enraged. The hero replied that now that they knew about it, it was no wonder they felt disgust. She angrily asked what he intended to do with them, and that she would rather die than do something bad. The hero noticed that the mere fact of his origin aroused strong hostility in them. He said he had no intention of killing them, but it seemed the two of them hadn't yet realized their situation. He reminded them that they were now his servants, and must not forget it. He used his sphere skill on them as punishment for their insolence. The girls began breathing heavily and fell to their knees. The hero told them to watch their language when speaking to him from now on, and asked if they understood. The girls immediately apologized, and the hero mentally praised himself for forcing the two women to submit. Sometime later, in the Ark family mansion, someone called Maria's name, and she turned around. The maid asked the girl how she was feeling, and whether she had gotten used to the work yet. The girl told MIT that she had mostly gotten used to it, but at first she was worried she would be forced to do something shameful. Smith replied that in the end she was doing a very ordinary job. MIT asked Maria how things were with Mr. Absolute, and she didn't know what to answer. The girl admitted that at first she was worried about having to spend time with him, but after observing his life over the past few months, she no longer knows. The gentleman is surprisingly quiet, unlike the other members of the Ark family. The hero's speech is dominated by high-flown expressions and aggressive words. Most of his expressions are devoid of any emotion, but at times his face is like an open book. He has never raised his hand against his servants or his nobles, and the people around him have a rather good impression of him. MIT told Maria that this was good, and asked her to stay the same. The girl didn't understand what she was getting at. A loud sound was heard behind her, and the alarmed girl ran towards the noise asking what had happened. It turned out it was Vul who had broken the vase, and the hero was comforting her. Maria couldn't understand why he always tried to act like a jerk, but was actually anything but. With his actions, he confused the girl to the point of horror. A few months later, Maria asked Mita if she really intended to retire in a couple of months. The old woman replied that she did. The girls had quickly mastered the maid's work, and now Wool could handle the cleaning herself. Her task was complete. She asked the girls to take care of the master in her stead. Maria asked Mita if she wasn't afraid of Mr. Absolute. The old woman replied that she would be lying if she said that she was not afraid at all, but did the girls see the reason in something else? Since she officially became the maid of Mr. Absolute, she had the right to know about his skill, absolute evil. Hearing this, Maria was annoyed, saying that it turned out that such a terrible impression was created because of his strength. MIT said that the servants of the Ark family sympathize with the young master, so they inevitably end up taking on secret missions, which is why the master has become extremely serious and rarely smiles. She said that responsibility for this lay with the adults. She knew it was asking too much of her, since Maria was still young, but she asked that the girl continue to support the master. Already standing at the door of the hero's room, Maria announced that she was going inside. The hero turned around, seeing that it was Maria. The girl explained that she had taken over Mrs. Mitt's duties and would now be taking care of him. She also confessed that Mrs. MIT had told her about the hero's skill. The hero answered meekly, as if it didn't bother him, and the girl asked if it really didn't bother him. The hero asked who cares about other people's opinions anyway. He is Absolute Ark, and he is who he is, let him say so. Deep down, he knows that everyone sees him differently. Maria noticed that his gaze was full of determination and sadness. With such determination, he will continue to live despite the pain. The girl stretched out her arms and unexpectedly hugged him from behind. Embarrassed, the boy asked her what she was doing and told her to leave. The girl ignored his cries and called out to him. She said that from now on she would be by his side as a servant, maid and sister, and asked him to let her heal his wounded heart and she would never leave him alone. Sighing, he replied that he understood everything and asked to let him go and prepare a bath for him. The girl asked if she should join him, and he shouted back that she shouldn't. Despite this, they continued to take a bath together. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the stranger grinned and clutched an object in his hand, saying he would use it to destroy the Ark family. Sitting at the table, Willen asked his son if he understood everything. The man had said it many times, but the kingdom needed the Ark family, not only to manage state affairs and combat unruly members of the royal family, but also to regulate relations with foreign noble houses. The Absolute replied that he understood everything. In the original story, members of the Ark clan were portrayed as simple villains, but in reality, they were unsung heroes working in the shadows to protect the nation. Given the potential for betrayal by his own people, there's a risk that the prince will be rejected in the future. Continuing to serve the royal family is risky. The hero decided he needed to think of countermeasures. He asked his father what his task was this time. Villain said that there are gangs in the capital that are not connected to the Ark family and that they are putting a spoke in the wheels of the Empire's rule, and there are about 300 opponents. He ordered the hero to kill them all, leaving not a single one. Leaving his father's office, the hero thought about the gang located in the aquamarine territory on the border between the Kingdom of Liriana and the Empire. The prime suspects were a family close to the Imperial Palace. The hero thought of Duke Noir. The Noir family is known for its involvement in underground activities and has recently been trying to expand its influence to other lands, so the Kingdom of Liriana naturally became a target. The Noir and Ark families may have different goals, but they have a long-standing conflict. This is what's called an institutional rivalry. Stepping out into the hall, the hero called out to Maria and Vul. He told the girls that he'd been assigned a mission, so he was leaving the preparations to them. Maria asked him if he was going anywhere. He confirmed this, and the girl asked to go with him. She promised they wouldn't be a burden, and Vul began to beg them to accompany him. The hero, throwing on his cloak, replied that there was no need, as he could manage on his own. He said that besides this, he might not be back by night, so they shouldn't wait for him and go to bed. The girls looked at him sadly and replied that they would carry out the order and asked him to take care of himself and be careful. Aquamarine territory. The man shouted to the crowd that by crushing the leader of the opposing family, they would protect this country. Raising his staff, he shouted that the end had come for the Ark family, and the crowd roared. One man sensed something was wrong, but it was too late, because someone was already aiming for him from above. The hero activated the black hole skill, and the darkness swallowed up the people. Tech managed to retreat and watched in horror. The leader shouted for his men to calm down and said it was just teleportation magic, and that those who had dodged it should attack. But at that moment, his men were already dying. Seeing the corpses, he shouted, asking the guys what was wrong with them. Having reached the leader, the hero wounded him while he was screaming. The hero continued to knock out one after another. Finally finishing, the hero was surprised that this was the end and a waste of time. But he didn't understand what these people meant by unsung heroes. While leading the cart with the horse, the hero called them just pathetic pecks, as he thought, the royal family is hopeless and he needs strength. The hero needed strength to withstand the onslaught of enemies, and that was all he could think about. He suddenly spotted someone on the other side of the carriage. The unknown man wanted to hide but was frightened by the head that fell near him and, having fallen, screamed in fear. The stranger shouted that she was a servant of the Noir family, and that if the hero touched him, they would not stand idly by. Upon hearing this information, the hero asked again about the Noir family. Grinning, the Absolute said that this was exactly what he needed, a worthy opponent, but first, the servant would have to die. The boy crawled back, asking why and who he was. The hero replied that he was evil. He said at the end that he was as evil as all of them, and used a black hole. Sometime later, Absolute returned to the mansion, where a servant had already met him. Maria greeted him, and the hero said he'd already told her to just go to bed. Maria replied that the gentleman was doing his duty to the country. She wanted to greet him first. He, surprised, asked how she knew about it. Maria replied that it was all Vul who was worried about him and told her everything, and yet Maria was surprised and could not imagine that the Ark family was assigned such a role. The hero realized that Vul's skill was enemy search. Maria hugged the hero, and the hero mentally called her a brat and decided to scold her later for lying. The hero didn't understand what kind of hug this was. Maria said that it meant her master had been fighting for their country all this time, even at such a young age, and she hated it. She screamed that she hated the fact that the adults of this country were forcing her master to fight. Hugging her back, he told her he was fine and that, as far as she could see, nothing terrible had happened. She replied that wasn't true and that he was injured. She screamed that his heart was so wounded he couldn't feel a bolt. The hero wondered if he'd simply gotten used to it, or if it only seemed that way. He smiled, thinking that she was so wounded that she no longer felt pain. If so, did that mean he had screwed up? The girl called out to him. He didn't deny it and told her to go to bed, as it was already late. She wanted to say something else, but she wasn't the one to say it, so she agreed and asked if she could sleep with him tonight. He replied that it wasn't worth it. A few days later, the children were discussing a martial arts tournament in the capital. Claire asked the hero why he shouldn't take part. She was sure he would win in the under 15 category. The hero pulled away, thinking she was too close. Chris replied that he too would be competing in the under 15 category, and that it would be a good opportunity to gauge the strength of his peers. In addition, Jose heard that a hero would be taking part in the tournament this year. Hearing about the hero, Abaliyut became intrigued. Later, at the Marquis of Mirai's estate, the girl breathlessly announced that she had finally found him. She called out to Alt, shouting that he'd skipped class again. It was Alicia Mirai. The boy named Alt, who had been a hero, replied that he had no desire to. Early in the morning, the hero began to gradually wake up. Leaning against something, he felt softness. Maria Stella, the Ark family's maid, turned out to be somewhat gentle when she wished him good morning and asked where he learned such things. The hero was taken aback when she said everything was fine and that her sister would take care of everything. He yelled at her to go away. Vol, the Ark family's maid, was wiping the dishes at the time when Maria approached her, calling out to her. She asked if the gentleman had returned to his room yet, and Wool replied that yes, he had left right after breakfast. Maria decided to help Wool. Maria noticed that Wool was in a great mood today, and Wool replied that the gentleman had given her chocolate. She said that if the gentleman hadn't given it to her, she would never have known something so delicious and sweet existed. Maria was pleased to hear this and asked if that meant breakfast had gone without incident. Wool burst into tears, saying that the master had scolded her. She said she'd been scolded for eavesdropping on a conversation using her skill. Maria realized it was her fault and apologized to the girl. Wool said she'd been worried about the gentleman, which was why she told him, but Maria already knew. She felt the same way and wanted the master to rely on them a little more. Maria knew he was showing them this way. Wool asked Maria if she was busy today and explained that she and the master had planned to have a training match today. That's why she'd popped into the kitchen for a moment. Wool really wanted to go with them. She wanted to become much stronger so she could protect the master. Maria asked if they hadn't sparred yesterday, and asked Wool to give her the spot. She wondered if she still had things to do. Wool said she did, and Maria suggested they finish it together quickly. Sometime later, Maria pointed her sword forward, telling the hero that she would not lose today. The Absolute told the girl to hit with all her strength, and she immediately rushed into battle. They began the battle by repelling each other's attacks. The hero's attacks were accurate and made the girl nervous. As a knight, great hopes were placed on Maria, so how could she be so inferior to the hero? The hero told Maria to spar again. She, looking at him, remembered her brother from the past. In the past, her brother Ortega also asked to repeat the fight again. She is Maria Stella, born a noblewoman. She and her brother were practicing when Maria and Ortega were called out. Her father was an outstanding knight, and her mother was a strict but very loving woman. She also had a sweet brother, Ortega, who enjoyed everything in the world. Their family was happy, but suddenly, their peaceful life came to an end. Some time later, Maria approached her mother, who was sitting by the bed, and asked about her father and Ortega. The mother said that even healing magic wasn't helping. They said there was no magic that could cure them. Maria screamed that it couldn't be. She didn't believe it, saying that there had to be something they could do, otherwise her father and brother wouldn't survive. To cure them, they borrowed money everywhere, turned to bishops and potions, but they both died. Maria lost her beloved family, leaving only an unbearable debt. She had no choice but to follow them, but she didn't want to repay the kindness of those who had lent her money for her family's treatment with anger. The girl said that she still had unfinished business, and was asked if she was sure. The precious sword Stella, imbued with unique magic, a family heirloom she was destined to inherit from her father. The girl felt she had no choice. Even after giving up everything, she couldn't repay the debt, and their lands became the property of the kingdom, and she was sold as a servant. The knight's promising future and happy, peaceful life came to an end. In the present. The hero and Maria continued their battle. When she first saw Absolute, Ark, even though he was the same age as her late brother, she found him an unpleasant child. The hero jumped, dodging the blow, which caused the girl to be shocked. She feels not only sympathy, but also love for the gentleman who tries to be strong by hiding his pain. She couldn't understand why the master was making his little sister cry like that. Finally, the duel ended with the Absolute knocking the sword out of her hands. Maria Stella, born into a noble family, fought with her shining sword firmly gripped in her hands. A smile beamed across her face as she confidently and gracefully confronted her skilled opponent. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to them both. The heroes turned around joyfully and with relief, seeing their beloved parents in the distance. The girl's father was a renowned and respected knight, known for his valiant deeds, and her mother was a strict but infinitely loving and caring woman. Maria thought deeply for a moment about this perfect picture of family well-being and warmth. She also had a very carefree younger brother named Ortega, who genuinely enjoyed everything around him. Their close-knit family seemed like an unshakable and shining example of family happiness. But suddenly the idyll ended. Maria entered the quiet room and saw her mother, her head bowed over her sick brother's bed. The girl timidly turned to her, thinking of her father and Ortega. The woman only slowly shook her head. She cried out loudly that even the most powerful healing magic had proven useless. They said there was no spell capable of curing the disease. Maria cried out, not believing what she had heard. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes. She began to fervently plead that there had to be some solution, otherwise her beloved father and brother would inevitably die. The heroine recalled their happiest moments. To find the funds to treat their relatives, they borrowed money from everywhere, turned to various places, and drank potions. But it was all in vain. They both died. The girl was consumed by grief and darkness. The mother of the family couldn't bear their deaths. Maria looked at her exhausted mother, and horror and loneliness gripped her soul. She had lost her entire beloved family, left alone with only a crushing debt. It seemed to her that there was no other way out of this situation except to follow them. But deep down, she knew she didn't want to remain indebted to the kind people who had helped pay for her treatment. The girl slowly rose to her feet, determinedly brushing away the tears that had welled up in her eyes. She made a clear mental note that she still had unfinished business to complete. She suddenly found herself inside a stone hut. A quiet voice asked her if she was truly sure of her decision. In front of her lay the family sword Stella, imbued with unique magic that she was supposed to inherit from her father. The heroine looked at the weapon, realizing there was no other way. Even having sacrificed everything, she couldn't repay the debt. Their lands had become the property of the kingdom. She was destined to become a servant. The knight's promising future and happy, peaceful life came to an end. Maria sat on the floor. Suddenly, the sounds of swords striking were heard. A tense battle between Maria and the Absolute began. The clash of steel could be heard. When Maria first saw Absolute Ark, who was the same age as her late brother, she found him an unpleasant youth. He suddenly leaped high above her and swung his weapon. The heroine was surprised and shocked by this maneuver. She thought that she felt neither sympathy nor affection for the gentleman who was trying to appear strong while hiding his pain. The Absolute swung his hand with concentration. The girl also raised her sword high, preparing to parry the blow. Maria was perplexed as to why this young man was making his sister suffer so much. She was confused and upset. The fight ended, and they remained standing, facing each other. The heroine noted that this was her 10th defeat in a row. She wondered if anyone could defeat the protagonist, even beyond swordsmanship. The boy timidly replied that he wasn't sure, but he believed his father would easily surpass his skill level. Absolute added that his father was a true monster. Maria was surprised to hear such words from him. The young man continued that while his father remained loyal to the royal family, he could not be sure of his full support. The protagonist noted that he wasn't part of the original plot and didn't know what his father had done when the Ark family was convicted, but they must be prepared for the possibility that he might defect. Maria did not understand the meaning of the phrase in the original story and what it all meant. She stood behind him, trying to comprehend what was happening. The hero turned around. Absolute apologized. He suggested they continue the duel. Maria pointed to a bench. She noticed he was tired, so she suggested they take a break. The heroine added that she had prepared some treats. There were sandwiches in the basket. The young man's stomach growled. He was clearly glad for the opportunity to eat and rest a little. They sat down on the bench together to begin their meal. Maria took the sandwiches out of the basket with a smile and offered them to Absolute. She carefully brushed the crumbs from his face and then handed him a towel so he could dry himself off. The guy looked a little depressed and didn't show any emotion while eating. The girl noticed that they both seemed very tired and offered to lie down on her lap if he wished. The young man initially refused, as he didn't want to, but was suddenly grabbed by the shoulders from behind and pulled down. The next moment, Absolute found himself lying on the maid's lap, beaming with pleasure. She looked down at him intently. The boy was embarrassed and blushed slightly. The girl continued to smile and look intently into his eyes. Absolute remarked that it was very sweet. He smiled and calmed down. He realized that this was exactly the moment he had seen in that, quote, original story. The girl stroked his head, and he smiled happily. He felt unusually calm. After some time, they found themselves in a room at a large round table. The protagonist decided to announce an upcoming martial arts tournament in the capital. The maid approached the table. She remarked that the sweets looked especially delicious today. The hero informed everyone present that they would definitely go there. His comrades exclaimed with joy. Cruel expressed confidence that Mr. Absolute would certainly win, beaming with happiness. However, the boy corrected them, declaring that he wouldn't be participating and tossing aside his cup. The cup began to fall rapidly, but Wool quickly ran up and carefully caught it. She managed to catch it, straightened up, and noted that it was really dangerous. Everyone else turned around in surprise at what was happening. Absolute, watching this, chuckled. He explained that Wool would be participating in the competition. The girl, pouring tea for the gentleman, listened to this news. Suddenly, realization dawned on her. She froze in bewilderment, not realizing he was talking about her. She noticed everyone was looking at her. Wool didn't know what to say. Turning to the master, she asked again why they were sending her of all people. She shook with fear and blushed. Wool declared that she was weaker than the master and could disgrace him. The young man assured her there was no reason to worry, as she had trained with him. Therefore, she definitely wouldn't lose to Czerny. He also added that there was one more thing. If she defeated the hero, he would treat her to the capital's most popular dessert. Upon hearing this news, the girl literally beamed with happiness and exclaimed. Absolute clarified that if she became champion, he would buy her absolutely anything she wanted. He turned to the girl. Wool was beaming with happiness and loudly declared that she would go. The maid began jumping for joy, unable to contain her emotions. She blurted out that Wool wanted new weapons and cute little things. Chris noted that she seemed to already consider herself a winner. But becoming a champion is a true indicator of strength. The girl really wanted the master to see how strong and useful Wool had become. Her eyes lit up even more. She really wanted to try those very sweets. The protagonist approached the girl, asking her to crush him, and then she would get everything she desired. The maid clenched her fists and promised to win without fail. Afterward, they would definitely have to celebrate her victory. Alicia and Alt are preparing to participate in the tournament. A voice addressed to Alicia rang out from Marquis Mirai's estate, inquiring about Alt's whereabouts. The girl turned to her father, complaining that the hero was idle again. Alicia Mirai, Alt's fiancée and childhood friend, was concerned. She was immediately reproached and called a fool. The girl was strongly advised to be more careful. After all, the hero's skill was considered the most powerful divine ability. Anyone who possessed such power was awarded the title of hero. The heroes were so powerful that they became the defenders of the nation in the future. The father exclaimed that this was what happened to him whenever he got distracted. It was time for him to realize his responsibilities, and now was the time. The girl listened to him. They arrived to a decorated city, fully prepared for the upcoming event. Together, they reached the capital and headed for the tournament arena. Hero Alt was beaming with anticipation. He turned to Alicia, urging her to move faster. He was full of anticipation. She was surprised by his activity today. She noted that because of his frivolity, she herself was constantly being criticized. The boy clenched his fists and declared himself a hero. His job was to fight, so he left the studying to others, including her, Alicia. The girl countered that it didn't matter how powerful a hero's skill was if it was given to such a frivolous person. The boy didn't understand the point of her remark. She relayed that his father had told him to win the tournament to prove his worth. It sounded like a trivial matter. Walking carefree through the city, the young man wondered if he would face any strong opponents. He asked if his companion knew about this, but she suddenly froze. As she stopped, she remembered something. Alicia had noticed that someone from the Ark family would be participating in the competition. The hero, Alt, had commented that the Ark family was connected to the criminal underworld and would do anything to achieve their goals. He considered this and found it wonderful, as the situation was becoming more interesting. Alicia didn't understand his thoughts and only let out a worried sigh. The heroes approached the reception desk. At the reception, the organizer clearly stated that, as mentioned earlier, only weapons and skills were allowed to be used in the tournament. Magic was prohibited. She pointed forward and asked them to go into the waiting room. Hero Alt turned around and told Alicia he'd go ahead. She nodded and promised to watch him from the stands. She called out good luck after him. The boy didn't turn around and continued on his way. He noted that he was fighting against the Ark family, and as a hero, he would surely defeat them. He turned around one last time and said with a smile that all the villains would be destroyed. Alicia thought for a moment and whispered hopefully that everything would go well. At that moment, Mr. Absolute was approached from the side. Chris said he had something he needed to do before Wool's performance. The protagonist understood, but then Cruel suddenly realized something. She asked if Mr. Absolute would like some water, since she had prepared it herself. The boy turned around, wondering why she was offering him water she'd prepared herself. He noted that it was alarming, as he'd known something like this could happen. He didn't like it. He should have taken a closer look at her and gotten to know her better, instead of relying on his own knowledge. Rumor had it she was the best manipulator in the country. The girl asked if he wanted warm or cold water. The hero decided to take some, just in case. He asked that the water be at room temperature. Using magic, the girl concentrated on filling the glass. She smiled and handed the glass to the protagonist. She added with a smile that it was fresh. The young man took a few sips. Cruel had insisted from the start that it was just water. After a few sips, he praised the drink, calling it delicious. Hearing this, the girl blushed and turned red. She quickly thanked Mr. Absolute. She was flattered, because for some reason her water tasted better than that, prepared by other water mages. Suddenly, Chris returned and loudly greeted him. Cruel offered Chris a taste of the water she had prepared. The boy began to ask what this special water was. However, the Absolute ordered him to remain silent. At that moment, shouts were heard in the arena, and the stands filled with spectators. Vol entered the field, and the crowd erupted in jubilation. Cruel was perplexed by what weapon she should use. It didn't look like claws at all. No one could tell whether the girl would fight practically barehanded. Vol's greatest strength was her astonishing speed. Since low and long weapons weren't suitable for her, they created something for her that could cause serious damage with one punch. All the heroes watched the events in the arena. Cruel was delighted, believing this to be expected from Mr. Absolute. Chris, however, was concerned about Wool's condition. He believed that, despite her recent noticeable growth, she might still lack strength. The protagonist forbade her from using the address, and he noted that hiding an ace up one's sleeve is a basic strategy. He asked his friend to watch, as the girl had matured considerably. Wool stood on the battlefield. Soon, an opponent rushed toward her with a ball, preparing to strike. Absolute confidently declared that he had been coaching her. The girl watched intently, motionless. Suddenly, an opponent's ball flashed past her face. She glanced at it quickly and prepared to counterattack. Leaning forward, she quickly edged past her opponent. Chris was amazed at her speed. She moved quickly across the arena, and the young man couldn't comprehend that her opponent simply couldn't keep up. The Absolute was pleased with what he saw. He compared her to a wolf waiting for the right moment to pounce. The girl dropped to all fours and lunged at her opponent with her sword. It was noted that even in human form she succumbed to her instincts, circling her prey like a wild animal. Suddenly she launched a powerful punch at her opponent. The beastmen were truly beautiful. She put all her strength into the blow. The boy flew off and lay defeated in the middle of the arena. Chris was stunned by his absolute victory. He acknowledged that his choice of weapon was justified and apologized for his hesitation. Cruel commended the protagonist's foresight. However, the young man, without saying a word, thought he shouldn't be praised so harshly. The next duel was supposed to be against another hero. The protagonist tensed, anticipating his impending victory. He knew his opponent possessed a special skill. Although, in the original story he won, thanks to everyone's support, his powers were considerable. Absolute thought about the situation and decided to test his capabilities. Hero Alt took his place in the arena. He noticed that the attacker had been unlucky with his opponent. The opponent misunderstood him and remarked that he shouldn't have been underestimated. The hero assumed a fighting stance, saying that his opponent would see for himself. He brought his weapon into play. A fierce battle ensued, accompanied by the ringing of blows. The protagonist watched silently. Suddenly, he turned to Chris, asking if he was a true hero. Chris confirmed it. Absolute noticed that Alt seemed to be struggling with all his might. The hero realized that Alt wasn't weak, but he wasn't using his hero skill properly either. He simply swung his sword, overpowering with brute force, making his tactics noticeably inferior to Vol's. An enthusiastic crowd watched the battle. The heroes also watched the fight and were amazed that the hero Alt had finally won. Chris guessed Alt wasn't very experienced, but noted that few people possessed the same level of experience as the ultimate. The boy's eyes lit up. He remembered that the hero should have been handling the dirty work the Ark family carried out from the shadows. Then this young man would have gained experience, raised his level, and strengthened his mind. He thought with concern about where the country was heading. The final round of the Moscow Under-15 martial arts tournament had begun. Hero Alt began walking down a dark corridor, heading toward the arena. He looked smug, noting that he'd made it this far. The young man proudly acknowledged that among his opponents were some rather strong ones. However, he believed they were no match for him, a true hero. One more victory, and he would surely become the champion of this tournament. He was confident that his opponent from the Ark family would be defeated. Alt asked Acelia to closely monitor the upcoming match. A sudden flash of light illuminated the entire arena. Hero Alt firmly resolved that he would return, living up to his title as a worthy hero. Wool watched her opponent's every move intently and carefully. Their intense gazes met in the center of the arena, and both fighters instantly became combat ready. They slowly took up their positions facing each other, carefully preparing for the decisive attack. A loud roar announced the start of the grand final duel between Alt and Vul. The heroes exchanged quick glances. A sharp signal rang out. Vul rushed forward at her opponent, and the hero Alt was momentarily stunned by such a sudden attack. He tried to reach out to her, asking about the fate of the Ark family, as the girl continued to move rapidly around him. Suddenly she stopped, considering something. She whispered that she was doing this for her master. The young man didn't hear her words. The girl raised her head, smiled, and showed her fangs. Her gaze was full of concentration. Alt was surprised by the fact that, despite her youth and fragile appearance, a predatory glint could be seen in her eyes. He was perplexed, trying to comprehend what horrific preparation they could have given her within the walls of the Ark house. The boy shouted loudly, demanding the name of the Ark family member who had ordered her to participate in the tournament. The girl replied that if she won, she would receive a delicious meal, so she was completely prepared. She made a sharp dash forward, noting that she had no time at all for a long fight. Wool kicked her opponent's sword with all her might. The hero shuddered, and his hand began to tremble. He noted her great speed and strength, which made him wonder if this meant she was constantly undernourished. The boy angrily exclaimed, turning to the Arks, and declared that he would not forgive them for this. The girl, cowering, began to dart around the field, refusing to be caught. She struck one blow after another at his sword, which he used as a shield. The hero struggled to keep up with her, noting her incredible speed. Vul moved so swiftly that it seemed as if there were several of them on the field. She was incredibly fast and agile. Suddenly, the girl appeared right behind Alt. She delivered a powerful kick from behind, aiming at him, but again hit his sword. Alt cursed, complaining about how difficult it was to fight such a small girl, and asked her not to underestimate him. He made a decisive swing with his hand and cut the air. Looking ahead, he discovered there was no one in front of him. He couldn't understand where his opponent had disappeared to. Acelia shouted from the stands for him to look down. The boy froze, but was immediately hit hard in the jaw by a punch from below. Wool, using her technique, landed the blow. Acelia, watching from the stands, gasped at the sight. Chris also stood up, expressing his surprise. Absolute was pleased with the unfolding spectacle. Hero Alt began to fall. Blood began to flow from his nose. He landed heavily on the ground, motionless. Wool stood nearby, watching timidly. The crowd was unsure how to react to this sudden denouement. Suddenly, shouts erupted from the stands. Everyone cheered, declaring Wool the winner. The girl stood in the center of the arena, a little confused. She smiled and remarked that she was eagerly awaiting the promised sweets, already savoring their taste. Acelia Mirai was upset by her friend's defeat. Wool confidently won the competition, and Absolute Ark expressed his satisfaction with her. The entire huge arena rejoiced with joy, and the heroes watched the events from their seats in the stands. The girl stood opposite her defeated opponent to the enthusiastic, loud cries of the gathered crowd. Cruel exclaimed with delight that they had indeed won. They watched Wool in the arena, closely following her movements. The girl glanced around cautiously. The protagonist calmly noted that the owner of such a power could become a serious problem for them, but its owner turned out to be too inexperienced to reveal its full potential. He coldly concluded that if that guy had managed to land even one solid blow on Wool, then they would probably have lost the fight irrevocably, and that was why she didn't even let him try to attack. According to the protagonist, Wool was undoubtedly the strongest in this arena. After some time, the three of them walked slowly along a long, dimly lit corridor. Absolute noticed that in the original story, Alt was weaker due to his lack of combat sense. Without this quality, if he had gotten closer, they could have been defeated. From now on, he needs to keep a closer eye on the hero. Unexpectedly, Wool appeared ahead and, turning to her master, joyfully announced her return. She asked him to treat her to sweets and allow her to go shopping. Seeing the maid, the young man smiled and extended his hand. He praised the girl for her efforts and promised to reward her generously. Wool beamed with joy. The guy told her to take absolutely whatever she wanted. The girl was jubilant. In the bright room, Alt lay defeated on the bed. Alicia sat next to him. She expressed her surprise that even as a hero, he lost. The boy lay there covered in sweat, his eyes closed. The girl noted that he apparently relied only on brute force, hoping that defeat would teach him something. She found it difficult to find the words. Alicia also wondered why her father hadn't come up with a countermeasure instead of relying entirely on Alt. She felt unfair that she was being scolded for Alt's absences, even though in the end she would be the one responsible for his education. She felt very hardworking. Moreover, it was the father who decided to shelter the hero. Suddenly, Alt began to open his eyes and saw Alicia nearby. She called his name, exclaiming that he was finally awake and asking how he was feeling. Confusion was evident in the hero's eyes, and he quietly said that he had lost. Alicia confirmed this and asked if he had learned his lesson. Sitting up in bed, the hero decisively declared that he had made an important decision. Alicia Mirai was surprised, thinking he'd finally understood. She exclaimed that she'd believed in him and in his sense of duty. Alt frowned and firmly stated that he intended to destroy the Ark family. The girl couldn't believe her ears and asked again. He explained that after watching that girl in the finale, he came to the conclusion that the nobles who treated her so cruelly and forced her to fight should not exist. The rumors about the vileness of the Ark clan turned out to be true. Surprised, Alicia did not understand his words. She spread her hands and explained that the Ark family belonged to the high nobility. The girl decided that for a hero that was one thing, but for a commoner like him, destroying the high nobility was reckless. If he got involved with them, the Mirai family would suffer. Nevertheless, the boy was already pondering concepts and plans for crushing his opponents. Acelia asked again if he was listening to her. The hero responded, turning to his friend, that they must exterminate the Ark family together. The girl noted that he wasn't listening to her at all. Alt admitted that he couldn't defeat them alone. However, he expressed confidence that with her by his side, they would succeed. Alicia retorted sharply, urging him not to joke in such a tone. She stated that she would not support him with such unfounded arguments. In her opinion, in order for her to take his side, he had to find a compelling reason and assemble an impressive army. Only then will the girl be able to support him. Hearing this, the young man perked up. Alicia emphasized that until then, he should avoid conflict with the Ark family. She didn't want the Mirai clan to suffer because of him or her. The boy listened to her words. He picked up his weapon. Rising from the bed, he interpreted her words to mean she wanted him to gather soldiers from the royal family and crush the nobles. He concluded that Alicia thought differently. The hero stood up, smiled, and promised that he would definitely do it for her. The girl shuddered as if struck by electricity, stunned by his determination. Meanwhile, a new message from Prince Michael arrived at the Arkoff estate. The heir was ordered to deliver wool to the palace. The young man remembered the young man in whose honor they had recently held a reception. Michael had been one of those who had supported the hero in the original story. The Absolute decided that they couldn't allow the prince to become their enemy now. Absolute turned to Vol and informed him that they were going to the palace immediately, as Prince Michael had summoned them. Wool trembled with fear. She couldn't understand what she might have done wrong and began to worry that she might be killed. The young man hastened to reassure her, assuring her that no one would dare touch her. He suggested that perhaps the prince had simply caught her eye at the tournament and wanted to take her for himself, or something of the sort. The girl whispered the prince's name. Tears welled up in her eyes. She couldn't understand the reason for such fear and asked if her master hated her. Wool remembered all the moments they shared together. However, the guy firmly told her not to be afraid because he would not give her up. He explained that she could always refuse the prince's offer if she did not wish to join his side. Moreover, he promised to do everything possible to protect her. Absolute added that in the end she remains his maid. Wool beamed with happiness and approached her master. She hugged him tightly, declaring her complete faith in her master. The heroes soon arrived at the palace. They were informed that their mission had been successful. Prince Michael Lanana, the crown prince of the kingdom, greeted Ark and Wool. He invited them to sit. The Absolute turned to the prince. They sat down in the chairs opposite, looking at the numerous guards with bewilderment. The entire room was heavily guarded. The protagonist considered this number of guards excessive for simple protection. Michael explained that, as next in line to the throne, he was under intense scrutiny, and any threat to his life could lead to disaster. He acknowledged that they might be uncomfortable, but asked for a little patience. Wool became enraged, and an aggressive aura surrounded her. However, the boy calmed her down, telling her everything was fine. He decided to discover the true purpose of their summons. Michael replied that it wouldn't take long as it took to subdue them. Absolute Ark's gaze suddenly became determined. Michael pointed his finger at Wool and demanded that she join him. In exchange, he promised to pardon the protagonist. He firmly declared that he refused all of this. He expressed surprise that this was all they wanted to say and announced that they would leave. Suddenly, a sharp, gleaming sword was pointed directly at the hero. All the guards immediately drew their weapons, preparing to attack. One of them still held his sword, aimed at the Absolute. Ark asked what they were trying to do, and why the guards had drawn their swords. The boy turned to them and furiously warned them for the first and last time to immediately return their swords to their sheaths. All the guards were frightened. Michael watched and laughed. Michael jumped up from his seat. He couldn't believe such foolishness, calling the Ark family utterly stupid. He doubted the young man could withstand such a number of guards. The prince braced himself for the inevitable attack. Michael noted that it seemed the hero needed to be taught a lesson. He approached Wool, asking her opinion. The prince promised that if she defected to his side, he would definitely accommodate her. Suddenly, the girl rushed toward the Absolute and hugged him tightly. She loudly declared that she was his maid, and her master would never lose to Michael. The enraged prince screamed for her to disappear and die. The guy looked at both of them and said that he sees everything. He declared that they would be killed by the guards for the audacity to raise arms against him. That would be his version of events. He loudly commanded the guards to defeat Absolute and Wool. The guards drew their swords and charged the heroes. Suddenly, they were frozen in a dark energy. They couldn't speak or move their hands. Michael was puzzled by what was happening and froze. The hero turned to Wool, telling her to call for help. He asked her to tell him that Prince Michael had gone mad and ordered the guards to kill the heir of the Ark family. The girl rushed out of the room and headed quickly for the exit. All the opponents were immobilized. Their weapons fell from their hands. They remained bound, unable to utter a sound. Absolute turned around and sharply parried the blade flying at him. With one swing of his weapon, he cut off the guards' hands. They remained bound and still unable to move. The young man emphasized that he had warned everyone. The guards still stood there, unable to move. The protagonist stated in a firm voice that he would not repeat what he had said a second time. He cast a spell, returning everything to its place, and the guards collapsed to the ground. Michael sank into a chair, trembling with terror. He turned to Ark, not understanding his actions. Absolute climbed onto the table and asked if it was really impossible to kill the heir to the highest nobility because of some personal desire. Michael admitted he simply couldn't stand him. He'd heard this many times before and asked the prince to repeat it. The prince was furious, his whole body shaking with anger. He shouted that he was irritated by the hero's eyes, his behavior, and his very existence. Michael called him an upstart. The young man slowly rose from his chair. Everything became clear to the hero. He raised his hand right in front of the prince's face. Absolute Ark shouted that the prince had tried to kill him, and he knew full well what would follow. He asked if he had been understood correctly. The hero activated the skill, King's Dominion. He channeled magic and aimed it at the prince. Michael's throat began to tighten, and he began to sweat. Suddenly, the doors behind the hero burst open, and a scream was heard demanding an immediate end. The king himself ran into the room and loudly ordered both sides to lay down their arms. Absolute turned, smiled, and addressed the monarch. He greeted his majesty and inquired about his well-being. The man exclaimed that everything had gone terribly. The king himself had appeared in person. The hero became curious about the monarch's true intentions. Absolute Ark sat opposite his majesty, and they discussed pressing matters. Michael, waving his arms, loudly declared that the guards would kill the heroes for the audacity with which they had dared to raise weapons against him. He intended to present precisely this version of events. At his command, the guards drew their weapons with approving murmurs. The king watched the proceedings with detachment. Meanwhile, the Absolute showed the monarch a video recording of the entire incident, showing how he, in turn, dealt with the guards after the incident. The king couldn't understand the footage he was seeing. Meanwhile, the recording device captured every detail of the scene. The protagonist explained that he had prudently filmed everything using some kind of magical artifact. His Majesty sighed heavily, broke out in a sweat, and fell into deep thought. He turned to the Absolute. He nodded, expressing regret for what had happened and asking for forgiveness. The young man emphasized that the Ark clan had always supported the royal family, even if it meant staining their hands with blood to ensure the country's governance. He expressed surprise that their loyalty had been met with such generosity. The boy approached the king from behind and bitterly asked why this decision had been made. He warned that if it were to happen, the Ark family would be forced to reconsider its position on royal authority. The king remained tensely silent. A silence fell, broken only by the smile that appeared on the hero's face. His Majesty, drenched in sweat, muttered that Michael was to blame for everything. He added that they might not believe him, but he couldn't even imagine his own son capable of such vile acts. The monarch approached the Absolute, inquiring whether the guards' punishment had been excessive. He asked whether the conflict could have been resolved through more peaceful means. Absolute objected, reminding them that the guards had attacked a member of the high nobility. From his perspective, it was pure self-defense. The guards hadn't heeded the warnings, meaning the blame lay entirely with them. They had to correct Prince Michael's mistake, even at the cost of their own lives. It wasn't the boy's fault. The young man sank into a chair to discuss his next steps. At that moment, Wool shuddered. The protagonist clarified how exactly the royal family intends to bear responsibility for this incident. The king proposed to pay compensation to the Absolute and his maid, and to place Prince Michael under house arrest. The man clenched his fist and excitedly asked if the hero would be satisfied with such an offer. The guy noted that there was a call to arms by a high-ranking nobleman, an attempt to forcefully influence a servant, and then an attempted murder. For all this, Michael would deserve life imprisonment. Suddenly, the king jumped to his feet, shouting protests. The Absolute added that at the very least, Prince Michael must be removed from his post as heir to the throne. The king was horrified. He waved his hands, begging them to think of something else, because Michael was his only son. Without an heir, the royal dynasty would end. The Absolute informed her that there was an alternative. Wool looked at him. The young man mentioned Princess Haniel. He supposed that if she married a worthy man, the problem would be solved. Wouldn't that be preferable to leaving Michael as crown prince, he wondered? The king agreed, admitting that Haniel was indeed more capable than Michael. However, he reminded her that the girl was blind and would be unable to fulfill her duties as ruler. The monarch recalled the image of the young girl. The protagonist agreed with this, but objected that in that case his Majesty and his advisors could rule. Absolute repeated his demands that compensation be paid to him and the maid, and that Michael be removed from the inheritance rights. He clarified that the final decision, of course, rested with his Majesty. The king broke out in a sweat and looked extremely stern. The greenhouse remained calm and quiet. Wool sat in the middle of the room, sipping tea. she was a little nervous but excited about the opportunity to enjoy some sweets. She asked the gentleman if everything was all right. He replied that it was compensation from the king, meaning she could enjoy the delicious desserts to her heart's content. Wool wasn't sure how to react to his words, and he gently advised her not to worry. Suddenly, she timidly inquired why he had decided to protect her. She expressed concern that if the prince became their adversary, it could lead to serious problems. The hero confirmed her fears. He noted that making an enemy of the prince was practically the same as incurring the wrath of the entire Kingdom of Lirian. The girl shuddered at this information. However, the young man continued, explaining that the royal family had attempted to take Wool, who had sworn allegiance to them, by force. He called it outrageous and emphasized that he was furious. He recalled that the Ark clan had owned these lands long before the founding of the Kingdom of Liriana. Regardless of their allegiance, this entire territory belonged to the Ark family. Therefore, they had no reason to surrender their servants to the royal power. Vol froze, unsure how to respond to such a statement. The Absolute explained that she was a maid, serving the Ark family. As her master, he considered it his duty to protect her. Therefore, she had no reason to worry. The boy added that the Ark clan always has many enemies, even if they don't take any active actions. The hero assured her that, despite the threat from the kingdom, he would take care of her. Absolute Ark noted that this wasn't news to him at all. He smiled. Vol looked at him carefully, and a spark lit up her eyes. At that moment, memories of dark, full moon nights washed over her. They shouted at her loudly that she had been abandoned, calling her weakling. Her fellow tribesmen mocked her, for in the wolf tribe, the weak were not favored, even within their own families. Strength was a source of true pride. Vol always felt lonely. She sat on the ground and cried bitterly. Because of her weakness, she was only a servant. Moreover, she wasn't even fit to be a good maid. The girl took her lot in heartbreakingly. She was provided with shelter, food, a bed, and a feeling of warmth. So the girl declared to the Lord Absolute that she was ready to protect him, even if it cost her her life. The young man remarked that he was not so weak as to require sacrifice. The next day arrived, and tensions in the kingdom began to visibly rise. The head of state sat on the throne, and his son, Michael, knelt before him. The king asked his son if he realized the gravity of what he had done. The young man lowered his head and declared that the Absolute was to blame. He claimed that it had attacked first, and he had no choice but to strike back. The ruler took out a recording device and asked if Michael would dare to repeat his words when watching the recording of what happened. The young man exclaimed in amazement, not understanding how this was even possible. The king explained that the recording had been provided by the Absolute, and that his son had committed the unthinkable. The heir didn't know what to say. He threw up his hands and shouted that it was because of the Absolute. He called him a coward, and all the blame, in his opinion, lay with him. It was he, according to Michael, who ruined his 10th anniversary reception. Michael shouted that this was precisely why he intended to teach him a lesson. The head of the kingdom bowed his head and said that he had previously told his son that what happened was due to the duke's intrigues and not the fault of the Ark family. The Ark clan, it turned out, was the victim in this incident. The young man declared he didn't believe a word of what was said. The king firmly declared that his son had committed a crime regardless. He turned to Michael and announced that he was being stripped of his status as crown prince. The boy shook with horror. The king noted that such offenses usually resulted in imprisonment, and he should be grateful for such leniency. Michael cried out, demanding an explanation as to why he should refuse the position of heir, because it seemed absurd to him. The king explained that if the young man showed this footage to all the nobles and apologized to the Absolute, he would consider the possibility of returning Michael to the status of heir to the throne. However, he added that such a step would spell the end of the royal family's future. The protagonist should reflect on his actions and apply the lesson learned in the future. With that, the conversation ended. The emperor ordered his son to leave. The boy, overcome with fear and terror, didn't know what to do. The king shouted at him not to dare ignore him. The young man stood up, begged for forgiveness, and clenched his fist tightly. The room emptied, and the monarch remained seated on the throne, lost in thought. He realized his son was still broken. He had hoped that Michael would mature with time, but he couldn't imagine it would reach such a pitch of madness. Now the main problem was the appointment of Hannul as crown princess. He didn't know what to do. The man began pacing the throne room, lost in thought. He saw no way out. His trusted advisor stood behind him. Suddenly an idea occurred to the monarch. The king asked, what if he arranged Hannul's engagement to the Absolute? The thought struck the advisor, and he became frightened. The ruler continued his reasoning, noting that this might not be a bad decision. Opposing Duke Zen, who supported Michael, would have meant confronting an enemy, but improving relations with the Arks was more dangerous for the country. By getting closer to the Ark family, they could also gain significant support from them. Should they move in this direction? The advisor asked His Majesty to wait a bit, to consider everything. 5 years passed. The Ark family estate was still bustling with activity. At that moment, the fight broke out. The sword flew to the side, hovering in mid-air. The girl leaned over her fallen opponent. It was Maria Stella. She was 20 years old. She lamented that she hadn't been able to keep up with the hero lately. Maria admitted that this upset her a little, even though she found him adorable. Suddenly, someone called out to her from behind. It was Vol. She informed Maria that she was currently being trained to fight. Vol was already 13 years old. She approached the Lord and insistently asked for permission to fight her. She really wanted it. The girl looked ahead and saw the hero there. She turned to the Absolute, who was 15 years old at the time, with a plea. The youth, now fully grown, seemed a source of admiration to everyone around him. As a villain, this was vital. He found himself in a spacious, bright bathtub, completely enveloped in steam. It had been decided that bathing was the best time to ponder important matters. Absolute Ark had turned 15. Entry into the capital's academy was supposed to mark the beginning of the main plot of Inanna's Chronicle. At that moment, the door to the steam room opened slightly. It was Maria Stella. She turned to the gentleman, offering to help him and wipe his back. The young man politely declined, noting that it was not necessary. The girl asked in surprise why he hadn't taken care of this himself. The guy reminded that he had warned that from now on he would take baths alone. However, Maria declared that she had already decided to wipe his back. She also began to gradually enter the warm water. A moist steam enveloped everything around her. The girl explained that she had no objections whatsoever to sharing a bath with Mr. Absolute. The hero watched what was happening, finding the situation very strange. Maria Stella added that tomorrow was a very important day, for which the protagonist had been preparing so diligently. The guy assured her not to worry. Everything would go smoothly. The girl hastened to assure him that he needn't worry about anything, as she would take proper care of him. He sharply demanded that she leave him alone. The crossed blades will inevitably determine the fate of the hero and his enemy. Absolute's father decided to explain to his son the unique magic of their family, the summoning of spirits. He asked the young man if he knew that the first head of the family had established a connection with the Spirit King. The boy confirmed that he had this information. He looked up. To fully master magic, the man explained, he needed to destroy a powerful being. Furthermore, his son would have to accept a mark carved into his own skin. The father showed him his hand. The man added that, of course, he wouldn't allow himself to be killed without reason, and his son would have to make a difficult decision. The protagonist remained silent for a long time, unsure of what to say. Suddenly, he raised his head and informed his father that he had already decided everything for himself. In the original story, the father would have been dead by the time he inherited this power. The Ark family had already shed its blood. The father asked when the last time they fought was, mentioning that it was when his son was 10 years old. There was tension between father and son as they looked at each other in silence. Suddenly, splashes of dark liquid were heard behind the head of the family. A black hole formed behind him. A multitude of dark shadows enveloped the space and began to rush towards the man. With a deft flick of his wrist and the aid of his weapon, he unleashed a blast of black flame. The blade was thrown far and severed the dark energies flying toward him. Absolute was astonished, as his level was already over 90. The average warrior in this world was 20. In the story, there were no characters above level 50, with the exception of Absolute. But his father's strength was astounding. Looking at him, the hero realized that his father's level was definitely higher than 50th. The man turned to the Absolute. Like his father, he decided to acknowledge that the young man was quite strong. He accepted this, but the difference in accumulated experience was too great. And although this might sound a little harsh, he himself prepared for battle and shouted that it was now his turn to attack. They took up fighting stances. The father raised his sword to his son's face. He skillfully dodged and parried the blow. A fierce sword fight began. The protagonist jumped back. The father also found himself behind and was thrown back. The man expressed surprise that his son was able to stop his blow. The boy, in turn, was surprised and looked ahead. A new attack was also rapidly approaching him. The man made a long swing with his sword. The young man managed to jump very high at the last second. He didn't immediately understand what was happening and lost some of his coordination. It stunned him. He remembered the screams he'd heard about how he was having to cope. His father had started using dark magic. The wall behind him began to crumble, unable to withstand the impact. The Absolute saw this and froze in surprise. After the attack ended, the protagonist sank to the ground. He realized that his father, the man who had dedicated decades to protecting this country, possessed incredible strength. He hadn't expected it to be so great. Looking at the holes in the walls of their estate, the man shouted that everything was going according to plan, and this was just the beginning. The boy considered the need to apply a little more of his power. Suddenly, everything around him was illuminated by a blinding light, and the young man froze. His father, unsure how to cope, found himself in a white void and cried out in horror. Then followed a flurry of sword strikes, culminating in a deafening explosion. Having completely exhausted his arsenal, the hero swung his sword at his opponent. The father's face expressed a mixture of defeat and surprise. They continued to fight, using magic even in flight. Suddenly, another explosion thundered. This explosion collapsed part of the building's floor. The father carefully and skillfully parried his son's blow with his blade. He trembled with exhaustion. The Absolute, standing above him, studied him carefully. The young man, too, trembled slightly. The head of the family shouted that his son had become incredibly strong. He addressed the Absolute. The young man looked down at him, unable to find the words to respond. He pulled away from his parent. The surroundings were in complete ruin. His father began to rise slowly, feeling the magic concentrating around him. The hero considered his next move, as everything around them lay in ruins. The head of the Ark family held his hand. With a loud roar, he declared that this was their end, and that they must surpass him. He spoke this appeal to the Absolute. The man summoned the spirits, asking them to appear. He used the primordial spirit. The father raised his hand and activated magic, which enveloped the entire room. The legs of a slender girl materialized right in front of the protagonist. She appeared to be asleep, her eyes closed. A soft glow and energy emanated from her. The girl opened her eyes and stared at the boy. Absolute Ark cast black hole magic, and everything was swallowed by a thick fog. Some time later, father and son were sitting in his office, discussing in detail what had happened. The man asked why he had spared him. He reminded him that without death, magic could not be fully transmitted. The Absolute didn't know what to say. Looking out the window, he realized how much his father had sacrificed for this country. If it was all for the sake of transmitting power, wasn't his own life too high a price? He added that if gaining this power required sacrificing one's parents, then it was a dubious victory. The father didn't know what to say. The Absolute reflected on how, in the original story, death had been a common occurrence for him. He would undoubtedly have done anything to inherit power. But the hero was different. The father asked what would be done now. After all, if he didn't die, the inheritance wouldn't pass on. The protagonist noted that he had already considered this matter. He approached his father, asking for permission to form a contract with a summoned spirit. Without unique magic, he would be unable to control spirits except those with whom he already had a contract. He was prepared to accept this outcome. If they do this, the magic will pass to him when his father dies of old age. The man paused for thought. Forming a contract with a powerful spirit required a tremendous amount of magical energy. However, in his current state, it was already possible. The head of the Ark family reminded that the loser carries out the will of the winner. 3 of the 10 spirits summoned by magic were under the complete control of the Spirit King. the Absolute was about to make a pact with one of them. He asked his son if he was ready. He answered affirmatively. The young man extended his hand forward and concentrated. A powerful surge of energy erupted. A beautiful woman appeared right before him. The man recognized it as a spirit of devotion. This spirit was focused on supporting its master's strength, expanding the magical radius, and strengthening their power. She was faithful. The protagonist asked the girl her name. The man explained that spirits could understand their speech, but in the human world they were deprived of the ability to speak. The young man looked resolutely at the entity that appeared before him and decided to call it Toa. He then asked the Toa to shrink in size. The spirit girl complied, and the boy praised her for her obedience. His father addressed the Absolute. The head of the family explained that although his son had not fully mastered the power, he had nevertheless entered into a contract with a powerful spirit. He added that upon completing his studies at the academy, the young man would undoubtedly become the head of the Ark clan. Absolute placed his hand on his heart and accepted these words with dignity, declaring that he would accept the offered title with honor. Now he looked forward with courage. Liriana's royal castle. The man, extending his hand, exclaimed that he never thought they would meet again. He expressed relief at learning that the head of the Ark family was alive. The Ark family admitted that he had narrowly escaped death. The king and the head of the Ark family shook hands. They sat down at the table. The Ark leader remarked that, having killed so many people, including his own father, he had never expected to live so long. The ruler asked him not to say such things. He recalled that the Ark family had made a huge contribution to the country's reconstruction. The Ark leader was not only his childhood friend, but also a trusted ally. The king looked attentively at his guest and confirmed how glad he was to see him alive. He would have liked Michael to demonstrate his strength in a duel. At that moment, a girl poured tea from behind. However, the Absolute, even in the king's opinion, proved more capable. Because of Michael's complexes and prejudices, the ruler had little hope for a good relationship between them. The king asked the Ark leader if he had considered the engagement of Absolute and Haniel. The man laughed, not knowing what to answer. The Ark chief explained that he had been planning to leave this life and had forgotten about it. He apologized, adding that he had planned to leave everything to his son upon his death. The king was at a loss for an answer. The Ark chief remarked that he felt tired of serving the country. He assumed that once his son became head of the family, he would likely not work so actively for the kingdom. This news shocked the ruler. But if the Absolute does not receive due compensation, then its future will be in question. At the Royal Academy of Liriana, people were bustling about the city, and numerous carriages were arriving. One man opened the carriage door and greeted Mr. Absolute. He nodded, agreeing with what was happening. The hero walked forward through the academy grounds, surrounded by his friends and comrades. He looked up. The boy had gathered everyone around him to discuss the upcoming exams. Chris explained that the tests would include writing, magic, and close combat. Based on these tests, the students would be placed into classes from A to D. He assured them they would earn enough points without distracting Mr. Absolute. Also expected this year was the reception of Michael the Saint and Hero. Care had to be taken not to tarnish the name of the Absolute. Chris turned to his master, saying it was his turn. The Absolute sternly ordered the crowd to give it their all. The crowd unanimously agreed. The heroes continued on and saw a saint standing before them. Chris pointed out to the master that the girl in the nun's robes was probably the saint. When she opened her eyes, everything around her began to glow. Chris was struck by the incredible aura emanating from her. The protagonist noted that this was the heroine from the original story. She repeatedly healed the hero during battles with the Absolute One, thanks to a skill called Restoration. Her beauty and strength boosted the fighters' morale. The young man thought about St. Eliza. She seemed as dangerous to him as the hero. If she hadn't left the church yet, she must be quite naive. Something had to be done before she started thinking about the hero. Chris turned to the gentleman, asking if this was the girl. The girl replied that she had come alone, without her fiancé. She looked worried. Absolute explained that the hero was taking the entrance exam to the academy, which is why he was not there right now. The hero received a letter of recommendation from the royal family as a gift. It was said that he was only half an aristocrat. The boy thought that the girl, with her naivete, would have a hard time at the academy. The male leader called all the applicants to assemble. They were about to fight a battle. Each would be assigned an opponent at random. This exam would test their mastery of swordsmanship and magic. The fight would continue until one of the participants left the ring or until the examiner terminated the bout. That was all that was announced. All that remained was to wait for everyone to be called. Cruel unleashed her magic, determined to fight her opponent. He noted this and cursed, realizing he couldn't get any closer. His friends watched in amazement. The boy couldn't do anything against these suddenly growing ice pillars. The girl stepped forward and summoned her magic again. The lady became much stronger after training with Mr. Absolute. Her opponent screamed loudly and rushed towards him. She looked intently at the Absolute. He only smiled at her. He noted that the outcome of this battle was a foregone conclusion. The girl emerged victorious, throwing her opponent several meters back. The observer declared the duel over. Lady Cruel was declared the victor. The girl ran up to Mr. Absolute with a joyful cry of her return. The young man noted that she had become much more capable. She took his praise as a great honor. The heroine fought so as not to be distracted by him, but his praise made her feel embarrassed. She admitted she blushed deeply with embarrassment. Then she wished the gentleman luck in his upcoming fight. He thanked her. Chris also added that the lady had worked hard. Cruel was surprised by Mr. Chris's presence. There was a certain animosity between them, which Absolute, standing in the middle, clearly sensed. Cruel inquired who would be Absolute's opponent. She asked if it would be Duke Kako, Marquis Marai, or Lady Alicia. Chris considered the possibility that the opponent might be a saint. However, since the participating aristocrats were mostly female, it would most likely be Duke Kako. Next, Absolute Ark was summoned to the arena. Friends wished him luck and promised to pray for him. The protagonist stepped into the ring and considered his potential opponents. Duke Kako, known as a bully among his subjects at Prince Michael's party, was a popular figure. Tristan Kako was rumored to be a talented individualist, even within his own family. He barely appeared in the original, so little was known about him. When his opponent entered the ring, the protagonist's friends were surprised. The guy himself didn't understand what was happening. All four of them found themselves in the ring at the same time and looked at each other. Saint Lisa, Alicia Marai, and Duke Kako immediately became visible. The young man bowed and greeted Miss Alicia, the Lady Saint, and the Duke of Absolute. He introduced himself as Tristan Kako. The hero looked at him carefully, unsure of what to say. Tristan explained that the examiner had been unable to clarify why they had all left. The man began to explain that, according to the rules, fights are conducted one-on-one. However, Lady Saint specializes in support, and her abilities can only be fully appreciated when paired with someone. Therefore, as an exception, a 2-on-2 duel will be held. The man focused on announcing the lineup. Guy and Alicia had to fight against Tristan Kako and Saint Eliza. Absolute was delighted to be paired with Alicia, considering it a stroke of luck. He noted that if he had been partnered with the saint, he wouldn't have been able to appreciate his strength. The girl shuddered in fear as she looked at the hero, but then slapped her cheeks and pulled herself together. She introduced herself. Her name was Alicia Marai, and this was their first meeting. The protagonist introduced himself in response. The girl asked how they would proceed. She could only use magic and attack from a distance. Everything became clear to the boy. He ordered her to attack Tristan until he got to her, and in the meantime not to attack him. The girl asked if he was sure. Since the saint couldn't fight, she could have helped him during the fight with Tristan. The hero added that even with the saint's help, he would have to fight alone. It would be unfair to beat him with 4 hands. Absolute Ark emphasized that he didn't like to overwhelm enemies with numbers. It was better to divide the roles and fight one-on-one. Alicia's eyes lit up. She apologized to the hero, admitting she had misunderstood him. An aristocrat like her shouldn't have acted like that. She decided to follow his plan and fight with honor. The hero asked if the girl understood that she was responsible for the saint. She laughed and confirmed that, of course, she did. They stood facing each other, and the battle began. The battle was declared to begin. Tristan Kako rushed forward with his weapon. The girl began to use her magic. She conjured a fireball. The projectile flew straight at the approaching enemy. Kako turned to the woman standing behind him. He informed her that it was now her turn to act. The girl closed her eyes and agreed. She used her abilities: support, protection, and self-healing. There was a powerful explosion, but it did no damage. Alicia rejoiced, believing her fiery projectile had hit her enemy. However, the protagonist immediately realized this was not the case. thick smoke billowed over the ring. The enemy didn't slow down. He continued to move forward at breakneck speed. He was covered in bruises, but he was smiling. Alicia was confused. She continued throwing projectiles. She noticed she was hitting her target, but he still didn't stop. The hero pondered the reasons for this. He realized the saint had activated her fear-removing skill. He began to worry about how the fight would turn out. At that moment, the saint smiled grimly. The girl tried to restrain her opponent, but he didn't stop, apparently immune to magic. The young man watching the scene pondered Saint Eliza's skill, which allowed him to act without fear. At that moment, the opponent was thrown back, the girl was surprised, and the young man decided that the time had come, since he couldn't afford to lose the entrance exams. The young man grabbed the hilt of his sword. It was his turn to engage in combat. The opponent reacted with delight, for the Absolute's moment of glory had arrived, while the hero, meanwhile, had already thrown away his scabbard. The boy happily declared that he'd heard a lot about him and his astonishing talent. This sparked his opponent's interest in facing the hero. The young man didn't share his pleasure, remaining calm. He was pleased that his dream was finally coming true. The day seemed truly wonderful to him. The enemy's face took on a sinister grin, demonstrating the anticipation the young man was in. He rushed into battle, starting the duel, but the hero, with a calm expression on his face, replied that he had talked too much. Their blades met with a loud clang. The hero was focused on the fight. The enemy was having fun fighting the Absolute, while her friend watched them anxiously, and the saint folded her hands in prayer. The opponent continued to attack, joking with the guy that he had already run out of steam. The next moment, he swung his weapon so that the blade almost reached the hero's face. Absolute realized for himself that the enemy turned out to be quite capable. Apparently, he had studied different styles of swordsmanship. When the young man parried the attack, his opponent was thrown back, but a smile played on his face. He was simply delighted that the hero had managed to hold out against him for so long. It had truly been the best day of his opponent's life. Then the boy suggested making the day of their battle their anniversary. Absolute began to get angry, not understanding what the man was even talking about. The girl closed her eyes in anxiety, and the young man only smiled slightly. The enemy began to attack again, simultaneously asking the hero why he hadn't fought with Alicia, since together they had a chance of winning. Ark parried the attack again, pushing his opponent away. The hero also remarked in response. Despite the saint's support, his opponent was still fighting alone. Fighting 2 against 1 would be base. Absolute's statement made the young man laugh. He prepared to attack again, recognizing that the young man was undoubtedly strong. The boy rushed toward his opponent, asking him not to use nobility as an excuse if he lost. The hero took the blow with his sword. Alicia watched the fight with delight. She noticed that Tristan, from a family renowned for martial arts, was strong. The girl decided it might be due to the saint's support. In any case, Kako had successfully confronted the hero. She was worried about whether Ark would even be able to win. The guy confidently pressed his opponent, causing the smile to disappear from Tristan's face. The girl was amazed by his good swordsmanship. Kako was thrown back, and he had to stop himself with the help of his sword, plunging it into the floor. A look of confusion crossed his face, as if he couldn't understand how this could have happened. He remembered Saint Eliza. Understanding his plight, she offered to help. She bestowed a saint's blessing upon the young man, and at that moment his strength increased. The young man thanked his companion. The opponent, feeling the power overflowing him, began to attack again. He rained blows upon Ark, but the hero himself didn't seem nervous. The boy noticed that despite his increased strength and speed, everything else remained the same. Tristan couldn't adapt to his new abilities. All this left the hero no other choice. The young man was curious to discover the full extent of the opposing team's abilities. Body enhancement magic itself isn't dangerous, but in large quantities it could become problematic. Eliza's skill also got rid of fear, which was reflected on the guy's face. Ark suddenly noticed that his opponent had become suspiciously quiet. The hero realized that he had seen enough, so it was time to end it all. He swung the blade again and sent Tristan flying straight into the wall. Blood gushed from Kako's mouth from the blow, and everyone looked in surprise at the aftermath of the Absolute's attack. The hero clarified that his opponent was a good swordsman, but lacked precision. He made a promise that next time they would fight for real, one-on-one, at the academy. Kako decided that the hero simply felt sorry for him, since he still had something to strive for. Suddenly a voice was heard. The hero turned around and looked at the saint, but she only raised her hands. Then victory was declared for Ark and Mirai. The girl looked at the young man leaving. She wanted to talk to him, but she didn't dare. She was tormented by doubts about what she should do. Remembering the past competition, she could not have imagined that the young man would turn out to be so strong. Alicia worried about what would happen if the Absolute fought Art, who had hatredfully threatened to exterminate his entire family. Tears welled up in her eyes. This was exactly what she didn't want. A real nightmare. Upon returning home, she hoped to talk to her fiancé. At the Arkov estate, the guests were chatting among themselves, and the hero stood on the balcony, glass in hand. A whole crowd of friends stood beside him. The guy praised them for their efforts, as they had all trained hard and given it their all. The boys were pleased to hear this. Now they were about to enter the academy, where the rumor was that status didn't matter. However, all this was just a formality. In reality, it was still extremely important. For this reason, the hero called on everyone to show the unity of the Ark House. Everyone despised the members of the estate, considering them villains because they earned money by getting their hands dirty with blood. Absolute was sure that since such an opinion had already been formed in their circle, they simply had to live up to expectations. But he knew that his family's work was saving people, and so he was proud of it. However, the problem was different. He was worried and angered by the fact that there were those who openly mocked them. Everyone present frowned at the hero's words, but he continued to speak out, considering those people arrogant. The boy repeated his request to show the unity of his home, and this impressed the boys. They were filled with determination. The young man reminded his friends that they were no longer weaklings to be mocked. Now they had to demonstrate their strength. The hero sincerely believed that the powerless evil would be trampled by the strong who considered themselves right, so they should fight it together. Absolute supported the boys, promising to always be by their side. As members of the Ark faction, they should be proud of their evil status. He then challenged them to show their pride. The beginning was made. The whole group, led by Ark, set off on their journey. Absolute packed his briefcase and announced his departure to everyone, as there was supposed to be an entrance ceremony. He asked Wool and Maria to take care of unpacking. Linana, Royal Academy with him, Morima. The girls agreed without further ado. The carriage pulled up to the main entrance, and the other students immediately noticed it. Absolute and his friends confidently moved forward. The Academy students were surprised that there were so many high-ranking aristocrats in the Ark family faction. Among them were even Yoris and Lady Cruella. There were rumors in society that the Ark family ran a terrible organization. Judging by the pressure that came from the arriving faction members, the rumors about them turned out to be true. Ark headed towards the entrance to the Academy, thinking that there, as everywhere, first impressions played a very important role. The boy understood he couldn't relax. He had to keep everything under control while he was around, but there was no other way he could help his subordinates. As the possessor of undeniable power, Absolute and his subordinates had to demonstrate the unity of the Ark family. The outgoing pressure made Ark and his friends and students shudder. The kids knew it was best not to approach them. Some even didn't want to be in the same class with them. However, there were those who considered Lady Cruella a beauty. There was a story going around earlier that someone had already tried to get close to the girl, but Ark almost killed him. The young man carried with him the thought for everyone to remember the Ark family and the Absolute who leads it. The young man, trembling with fear, approached Absolute and his friends, who were sitting on chairs, and apologized, saying he was supposed to be helping them, but had ended up in Class B. Suddenly, a hand fell on his shoulder, and Chris was told not to worry. The girl asked with a smile to trust the hero's help to her, because she would take care of everything. The young man asked about Orion and Misto, who were placed in Class A, and praised all the boys for doing well. Browse believed that all this was thanks to the hero's training. On his own, he could only get into C. Arka was starting to get annoyed by Misto's flattery and asked him to stop. The students began to applaud the professor as he entered the classroom. The man greeted the students and congratulated them on their admission. In Linen, aristocrats had to enter the academy at the age of 15, where they underwent training for 3 years. Besides aristocrats, the children of prominent merchants and those recommended by the church were also admitted. Even commoners with the support of aristocrats could gain admission to the academy. The most important factors there were status and academic achievement. Meanwhile, the professor gave the floor to the first-year student representative, Michael Linane. The young man expressed his gratitude to the director and the entire faculty for their warm words of welcome. He promised that they, as the people of Liriana, would become people that the teachers could be proud of, and that they would grow and learn. The boy had hoped to become close comrades so they could defend the country in the future and become stronger, lest they lose to evil. At his last words, Ark's gaze hardened. Michael encouraged his fellow students to work together and study for the next 3 years. However, the hero heard a different meaning in the student's words. It seemed to him that he only wanted to gather his comrades at the academy, defeat the Absolute, and regain his position as crown prince. Although the young man was stripped of his title, it seems that this was still not enough for him. The prince still had events that existed in the plot to come, and Ark, of course, was about to meet his best version. But the young man remained confident that in the end, only Absolute Ark would remain. After some time, Ark set off on the road, although he had said earlier, but soon the events from the original would begin, so he had to be prepared. The boy couldn't lose. He understood that he couldn't allow events to unfold as planned. His thoughts were interrupted by the maids sitting with him in the carriage. The young man apologized for his thoughtfulness and clarified that everything was fine with him, despite his nervous appearance. Then he told the maids that their job would now be to go with him to the academy and back, as well as prepare dinner. Therefore, the girls had to behave decently. The young man asked them if everything was clear, and they answered in the affirmative. Ark relied entirely on the maids. The hero arrived at the academy with an escort, where his friends were already meeting him, and Cruella wished him good morning. The guy decided to leave the maids at the entrance, and asked them to be in the waiting room until lunch. Wool was amazed at how huge the academy building was, and how crowded it was. Her friend was delighted by her reaction, as she seemed to be her old self again. The woman was bothered by her colleague's dejected expression, so she decided to clarify the problem. Wool believed that as her master's maid, she had to be perfect. She also wanted to be as mature as her companion, but not quite. The maid covered her mouth with her hands in emotion. She believed that Mr. Absolute was already pleased with the girl. She reassured Wool by pointing out that she was already doing a wonderful job. Suddenly, the young man called out to the girl. He recognized the maid as the very same participant in the tournament. She turned around and looked at the young man, and at that moment, their eyes met. The girl frowned and stepped aside, asking who the guy was. Without waiting for an answer, Wool turned away and walked away, apologizing as she went, as she was at work. The young man froze in bewilderment. He tried to stop her again and wanted to touch her, but he couldn't. Maria intercepted his hand. She was outraged by his desire to touch a servant of another house, as it was against the rules of decency. The maid then asked the young man if he knew they were from the Ark family. The guy was surprised by the strength of her grip. The woman was squeezing his hand quite tightly. He tried to justify himself by saying that he simply wanted to talk to the girl, but Wool herself decided that they wanted to blame her for this. A girl emerged from the crowd of gathered observers, asking them to stop. Alicia clarified that the guy was from her group, and then she became interested in learning about what happened. Maria felt annoyed when that girl approached them, because she literally couldn't stand such people. Meanwhile, Alicia sat the young man on her lap and promised to have a conversation with him. Then the girl asked which house the servants were from. She wanted to apologize to their master. She introduced herself in art, and the maids introduced themselves in return and said that they served the Ark house. Maria and Wool bowed slightly and promised to report what had happened to their master. Alicia was horrified to learn the origins of their new acquaintances. Art was also shocked to hear about the Absolute family. He lamented why all this was happening to him. The students gathered in a large room known as the Academy's training field. Alicia noted that it was quite spacious, but the Absolute had still not appeared. All students were asked to gather in the hall. Art was being held by 2 girls, and his friend was asking him to calm down. She'd heard about this young man's behavior, but she didn't understand why she had to go through it. Her father would probably scold her again. The guy called Alicia to pay attention, because the Ark family faction entered the room. The guys didn't greet them very joyfully. Many hesitated at the sight of the hero, while others were simply afraid. Cruella began to complain to Ark pointedly about how tiring it was to be popular. However, he didn't have to worry, because they were all with him. Misto forgave them for not taking things too seriously, while the other was outraged that they'd been treated poorly from the start and suggested they leave. Absolute, however, simply considered it because of the rude people. The students silently looked towards the hero, but he only sullenly asked what they were staring at, whether they were really looking for death. His words sent a wave of fear through the students. Alicia noticed that the atmosphere changed dramatically after the hero's appearance. Suddenly, she noticed Art running alongside her, and she managed to grab him by the arms and stop him. The young man looked as if he were about to jump into fire. Absolute was curious to see how many blows the former prince could withstand, but his friend suggested he avoid starting a fight at the very beginning. The professor caught the attention of the students, all of whom had recently enrolled, but were already starting to get rowdy. He liked their energy. Teach Todo introduced himself. He was in charge of Class A. He understood that they had all become classmates and were interested in getting to know each other, but staring at someone was quite rude. The teacher decided to take advantage of the increased interest and offered to use the premises for training fights. He understood that the boys wanted to test each other's strengths, so this was a great opportunity to get to know each other. First, they needed to split up. The man put his finger to his chin and thought for a moment, then assigned Art and Absolute as opponents. Alicia couldn't believe the reality of the professor's words, and the teacher decided to start with just the two of them. The girl urged the young man to act without foolishness, since his opponent was Ark himself. She turned in his direction, but the boy was no longer there. He was talking to another student. Alicia saw their smiling faces and decided to ask what Art was doing there. The professor called the young man, as he was already waiting for him together with the hero. The young man apologized for the wait, as this was their first time communicating. He introduced himself, but the Absolute already knew him. Ark noticed that his opponent seemed to be ignoring him. Something was clearly wrong with that situation. He explained to the hero that he knew little about him, but that he'd been lucky enough to fight him so soon. Then the young man suggested getting straight to the point. The Baron set conditions. If he could win the duel, would Ark be able to stop committing evil deeds? He knew about his family's connection with the Dark Organization, and also, in his opinion, the young aristocrat treated the Beastman girl badly. Alicia was horrified by what her fiancé was saying, but the guy continued to insist. If he himself lost, he was ready to honestly admit he was wrong. Absolute had no idea what his opponent was talking about. However, Art continued to insist on his own way, trying to force the hero not to look down on others. He swung and rushed straight at his opponent. Todo was outraged, because he hadn't given permission to start. The man blocked Art's path. It was unforgivable to call a classmate a criminal, so he should stop. The young man did not listen to the professor and knocked him out of the way. He then directed the hero's true evil-destroying Holy Surge attack at Ark. After he hit the enemy, the guy announced to everyone that it was a holy magic technique that hit villains, which meant it worked on the hero too. Suddenly a voice was heard. Absolute shook himself off after falling and parried Art's own words. Alicia was amazed that the young man had been able to withstand the holy attack. The friends were seriously afraid for their master. The members of the Ark faction were angry that Absolute had been hit, and even from behind, Art had to be stopped. They had already surrounded the boy, but the hero stopped them, as it was his fault. It was strange that the entire group wanted to fight one enemy at once. The guy was angry because everyone thought he was so pathetic that they would attack him in a crowd. Art let out a sound of displeasure, but acknowledged his opponent's superior abilities. He thought the holy attack would work. The young man began to attack again, this time using the holy sword. However, the young man didn't have time to bring the weapon to action, as Ark struck faster, hitting him in the stomach with his fist. The hero was too slow for him. The blow sent the young man flying into the wall, and Absolute turned away. He decided his opponent lacked talent and should have trained more with a sword. Art's voice was heard from behind. The guy was covered in blood, but with a smile he assured that there was none at all. The young man had no intention of losing, because there were so many suffering people in the country because of the Ark family. He considered it his duty to help them all. Therefore, the guy was able to get to his feet and rush at the enemy again. But this time, too, the Absolute surpassed him in speed. The hero grabbed him from behind and broke his bones. Seeing R2 getting worse, Alicia covered her mouth with her hands in horror. The young man fell but looked up at the hero with angry eyes when he called him a weakling. The aristocrat casually explained that his opponent was too talkative and lacked the strength to back it up. Despite possessing the skills of a hero, Art was, in reality, a weakling who could only assert his rights. But the young man himself did not agree with this opinion. He wanted to crush the evil in the person of Ark and save her. The Absolute confirmed his words. He is evil, the worst in the country. He promised to meet with this, quote, ally of justice. Alicia lost consciousness, and the professor also didn't recover from Art's blow. The young man himself was wounded. Saint Eliza, however, remained silent. The hero stood over his defeated rival, thinking that by killing him he could save everyone. However, Ark himself believed that his death would not change anything. Another evil would come in his place. The boy turned to the nobles of his faction, asking the lady to bring the other teachers and explain everything to them, while Misto was to tie the hero to a pole. Oriana was to keep an eye on him to ensure he couldn't escape. If they noticed any strange movements, they were to attack immediately. Everyone immediately set to work. Eliza hurried to the wounded man and immediately began to heal him. After some time, the young man talked to Eliza, suspecting that it was she who had pushed the young man to such behavior. However, the saint remained calm, surprised by his words. She insisted that she had done nothing of the sort. Alicia sighed heavily when she came to her senses. To her regret, what had happened was not a dream. The student anxiously asked if everything was okay. The girl thanked her for her concern and reassured her that everything was fine. However, secretly, she hoped it had all been a nightmare. Art publicly insulted a member of the Ark family, and besides, it all happened before the battle, which will become a problem for the young man. Alice still had to apologize for the incident with the maid, so it was necessary to be sincere. She looked around the corner and found Absolute. But then she noticed Saint Elsa next to him. The girl tried to listen to their conversation, but it was all in vain. But then she managed to hear Ark trying to pry information out of the saint, asking if she had used her skill to make the young man aggressive. But she pretended not to understand. Alicia was frightened to hear that they were talking about her friend. She concluded that the Absolute was planning to unite with the church and wipe out her family and Art from the face of the earth. Suddenly, the hero and his companion noticed her sitting behind the wall and eavesdropping. The young man looked at her with displeasure and then turned away. The girl literally felt the chill on her skin from his icy gaze. However, the young man left with her escort, without even leaving her a chance to apologize. Ark and his friends were sitting at the dinner table. The boy was shocked that the gentleman had managed to beat up the hero. Cruella added enthusiastically that he did it without a sword or magic, but with his bare hands. She couldn't believe her eyes. Oriana agreed with her. The girl was also amazed. The young man was dejected, envious, and eager to see the fight himself. Misto supported his friend, advising him to try harder and be in the same class with his master next year. Maria approached the hero with a report that Alicia from the Mirai family wanted to meet him. The maid wanted to know if the gentleman had any objections. However, the gentleman refused, asking her to tell the girl that he had no intention of communicating with her family and would hear from her later. The maid shared more news. Art had recently disturbed Vol's peace. Absolute's gaze grew cold. He still couldn't figure out what was wrong with that guy. Maria suggested taking the girl to a nice cafe when they left the academy. The young man thought the idea was a good one. The maid promised to pass on his words to Alicia. Wool was delighted with the cake and expressed her gratitude to the hero, beaming with joy. In response, he simply asked her to help herself, but when he tried a piece himself, he was delighted with the amazing taste of Mont Blanc. The hero had previously disliked this treat, probably because the Absolute itself had such an influence on him. The guy noticed Maria's gaze and asked why she was looking at him like that, deciding to threaten to take her eyes off her. The woman merely apologized. It was the first time she had seen the gentleman eat with such pleasure that the maid suggested starting to serve dessert in the mansion. The guy refused. He only wanted to eat it occasionally. The cake was really tasty. However, it was best to eat it before death. Ark asked Wool about the recent encounter with the hero to see if there had been any other problems. The girl remembered and began to get angry. The guy started being so familiar with her that it made her feel hostile. Then she told him that Maria had protected her. Ark was surprised that the girl was upset by the meeting with the young man. But then he remembered that main characters had this tendency to be oblivious to others. Personal space. It was quite pathetic. The Absolute reminded the maids of what he had already said. If he wasn't around, they had to defend themselves, as that was why he had given them power. The maids confidently agreed. Father wasn't opposed to Ark negotiating with the Mirai family, but he was concerned that everything was moving toward a compromise. This would likely harm the family, and the outer walls of the Ark lands would become stronger. But this would also mean interference from the aristocrats living nearby. Absolute explained that he had already received permission from the royal family, so everything would be fine. He considered an apology important and inevitable, so he wanted Alicia's family to be sincere. When the hero's execution was prevented at the request of the royal family, it became a huge problem for him. The young man intended to move in that direction. The man agreed that the boy would take the initiative and do as he saw fit. But he asked his son not to show sympathy towards them. If the Mirai family had initially shown due priority in raising the hero, nothing would have happened. The young man was confident of success because true evil was merciless. The maid entered the room and announced the arrival of the Mirai family members. In linen, the royalist faction, which supported the king, feared that too much power would be concentrated in the hands of the royal family and sought to consolidate it in the hands of the nobility. The neutral faction stood between the other two, providing balance. Members of the Mirai family were in the guest hall. The family's marquis was a royalist. Ark understood that the marriage between the hero and Alicia was a foregone conclusion, and his influence and power within the faction had grown. This was the young man's chance to cut Art off from his family. The guy entered the hall and saw two Mirai representatives there. The guests bowed to their hosts, and the young man measured them with his gaze. He quickly assessed the Marquis of Mirai. Even without the saint, his lack of education was a huge disadvantage. The hero sat down and invited the visitors to follow his example, but the girl looked dejected. The boy even thought the man was trying to shift all the blame onto her. The Marquis began by apologizing to the Absolute for the stupidity that the hero had committed. He considered this act unforgivable, but Art himself did not want to repent. It could bring even more problems, so he placed him under house arrest. The boy believed that despite the young man being a hero, he had committed a crime, and Ark wasn't about to let it go. He then asked the Marquis what he'd been teaching his protege all this time. The young man explained that the, quote, hero had called him a criminal without any evidence, and therefore suspected such rumors had originated in the Mirai family. The man, frightened, began to deny everything. He tried to prove that he himself hadn't taught the boy anything like that. However, in their family, his upbringing was entrusted to Art's peer, the Marquis' own daughter, Alicia. Absolute's suspicions were confirmed, and he became completely disillusioned with this man. Meanwhile, the father hit the girl, simultaneously accusing her of ruining everything. The daughter tried to explain that she was sorry, but the Marquis insisted that wouldn't be enough. He was interrupted by the hero's icy tone as he ordered him to be silent. The boy asked Marquis Mirai if he remembered where he was. After all, if he continued his public charade, Ark would kill him. The man instantly calmed down and apologized for his behavior. The young man told him that the Ark family had 3 demands. A magic stone was needed to restore the territory's outer wall. The Mirai family, along with the hero, would also have to pay 2 billion in compensation. Art would have to pay half the cost himself and would be suspended from his studies, and they would also have to break off their engagement with Alicia. The Marquis was taken aback by the conditions put forward. The sum was impressive, and his daughter's marriage to the hero was approved by the king himself. Ark reminded that Art could have been executed too, but it was only thanks to the intervention of the royal family that things went this far. Moreover, if the full compensation was paid, the engagement could be broken off. The young man considered these terms quite lenient. He then added that Marquis Mirai would be taken to the king. The man's mind was frozen in a silent question, but the young man explained that it was a royal order. The father jumped up from his seat, not understanding why the king had called him, since it was all Alicia's fault. Ark asked him why he thought so, since he himself was a marquis. The young man spoke frankly of the man's intentions, how he had decided to shift all responsibility to his daughter. But initially, Raising a hero had been the Marquis' responsibility. This meant that all responsibility lay with the Marquis of the Mirai family, and the king was ready to listen to his justification. Hearing the Absolute's opinion, the man began to tremble. The young man asked his father to take the guest away. The girl remained seated, but her hands trembled, betraying all her inner turmoil. At this point, their conversation ended. Ark understood that he had unilaterally imposed his demands on Mirai. Ark explained that the letter and notarized document would arrive from the royal family a little later. Alicia's father will be removed from his position as head of the family. She apologized for not trying hard enough and causing trouble for everyone, confidently believing that everything that happened was her fault. Art had an inexplicable hostility. He frightened the piece of the Ark family's maid, called Absolute a criminal, and attacked the teacher. The girl stood up from her seat, again admitting her guilt, but she was tormented by the fact that this was causing only her suffering. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. She knew she'd done nothing wrong, but every time her charge acted strangely, they became angry with her. Alicia wasn't sure if it was her fault that everything had escalated into a conflict between the families. She herself understood how stupid it was, because such an arrogant person with such strength would not obey her. Alicia burst into tears of regret, because she could never have done such a thing. The girl tried to apologize to Ark. After all, he was the one who suffered, and she shouldn't have thrown a fit in his house. But suddenly, she noticed the young man approaching her. Suddenly, he took Alicia's hand. She looked at him in confusion. Then she felt the absolute use, healing magic on her. They continued to stand close to each other, looking into each other's eyes. The hero supported him, believing she wasn't to blame. The only ones to blame were Art himself and the girl's father, who neglected his duties, as well as the Absolute. She tried to convince him otherwise, arguing that it was not his fault because he was a victim. The boy believed that if he had more overwhelming power, the hero wouldn't dare do anything. The Absolute had to demonstrate his full power in a way that even a fool could understand. For this reason, Alicia could hate him. She asked him again, confused, and the young man explained in more detail. She could put all the blame on him and relax. The young man considered himself the evil of this country, so there was no need to feel anger or resentment, only toward himself. It would have been better for him if everyone had considered him to blame for what had happened. The guest smiled and thanked him, but still preferred to abstain. She even joked that Ark had done nothing wrong, so it would be better to hit Art than him. The girl felt stupid because she was carrying everything on her own, but nothing was working out as expected. However, now she understood why the young men close to him adored him so much. To her surprise, Absolute turned out to be a good person. The guy was taken aback by such a formulation. He even thought the girl was out of her mind. He then asked Mirai if she would like to form an alliance with him. The guest did not understand his question, and therefore began to get nervous. Ark was quite straightforward. He offered to leave Mirai's family and the hero behind. If she agreed, it would be better to sign a marriage contract for convenience. The young man extended his hand to her, asking her to take it, and Alicia extended hers in response. Sometime later, at the Mirai family home, the girl broke off her engagement to Art. Now he would have to pay compensation of 1 billion, and of course he would stop attending the academy for that period. She asked if he had anything to say. The guy clenched his fists and apologized to his ex-fiancée. He tried to justify himself, because at that moment something strange happened to him. His body seemed to be floating, and his consciousness was distorted. The young man felt a strange sense of rapture. All his rationality seemed to disappear. Art realized that he couldn't contain himself. Alicia was surprised. Was the guy really taking some strange medication? But he denied it. The hero had no intention of entering into conflict with the Absolute in this way. After all, he had said he was gathering supporters. The young man had suspicions that the Ark faction might be up to something. After listening to his speech, the girl was completely disappointed. Everyone said that Ark was a villain, but unlike the hero, he took the competition seriously and had pride. She started shouting. If Art continued to insult him, Alicia would not forgive it. The young man still considered him a villain, and in his mind, someone had to do it. Mirai disagreed with him. If the Ark family had committed evil, then the country should deal with it. It wasn't something they could do on their own. After all, a hero's power shouldn't be used selfishly. The girl asked the young man if he understood what it was like to be wounded. Art couldn't find an answer. From now on, the boy had to leave home and become an adventurer to make amends. This was a new chance for Art to contribute to the country through a change in status. She stood up and headed for the exit, clarifying that this was his atonement. The young man wanted to talk to her, but Mirai considered the conversation over and asked him to leave. Art clenched his fist even tighter and apologized again to his ex-fiancée. As they parted, the guy told her to take care of herself. When he left, the girl stretched with relief. She didn't exactly hate him, but she didn't love him either. More like a nagging little brother to her, the hero was. But now, she could relax. From now on, the royal family will keep an eye on him. If he does anything wrong, it won't be Alicia's fault. She remembered Ark's words as he extended his hand to her. When the Absolute proposed to her, Alicia refused. Although the girl had only bad memories of her father and fiancé, the lands of Mirai remained her home and she their mistress. She understood that she couldn't just give up everything in order to live happily. Mirai liked it when Ark forgave her for shifting all the blame onto him and relaxing. Those were truly kind words, but she couldn't let it go like that. Then the girl began to think about how wonderful it would be to have a wedding. Ark approached the man with a weapon in his hand, the victim calling him a villain. At that moment, the young man plunged the blade into his victim's arm and then into his body. Looking at the mountain of corpses, Ark wondered what was going on in his life. Looking at the night sky, the young man could not bear it and screamed loudly. Waking up in his bed, the guy realized that it was again a dream about the Absolute, and this made him feel sick. Because death had become commonplace, the boy killed without any guilt. Having memories of his past life, he was able to change. But more likely, it was the Absolute from this world that made the situation more normal. However, the young man could not come to terms with this. He kept wondering why, after killing so many people, he still couldn't calm down. An image of Alicia appeared in his mind when she called him a good man. In contrast, Ark called himself pure evil. Killing people changed nothing unless it was done by himself or his comrades. Even if it was by order of the state, murder was evil. This led to the conclusion that the Absolute himself was a villain. Alicia was a little nervous about returning to the academy, her heart beating fast. When she entered inside, her friends greeted her with joy. They were worried about her and immediately began to ask if everything was okay. The girl thanked them for their concern. Suddenly, everyone became quiet and tense. Alicia turned to see what was going on. Ark and his retinue were approaching them. Seeing him, Mirai hesitated, unsure what to do. She debated whether to greet him or, conversely, pretend she hadn't noticed. The ensuing pause was broken by an academy student, who briskly inquired about Absolute's mood. The boy merely replied that she had been too noisy. Christina Zen was the daughter of Duke Zen, the kingdom's prime minister. This time, she promised to win. The girl taught the boy to value friends, and he decided to lend her misto if she was really bored. Alicia watched from the sidelines and was surprised that Christina called everyone by their first names, as even Mirai herself didn't address her servants that way. The girl felt uneasy at how quickly the two had become friends. The students were also discussing Zen and Ark's interactions, and Alicia was curious about what they meant. They told her that during her break, during magic lessons, the two had been inseparable. The newly made friends also sat at the same desk during the entrance exams. From then on, they continued to walk together, which surprised everyone around them. After speaking with Christina, Ark turned his attention to Mirai, asking what business she had with him. At that moment, the girl remembered his proposal. She replied that she thought the Absolute was the same as everyone else. The young man didn't understand what Alicia meant, and his friends were perplexed by this statement. The student thanked the lady for waiting. She promised to gather all the notes while she was away and return them later. This would be very helpful to Mirai. Then Alicia noticed a girl ahead. She greeted Princess Leone and apologized for not having done so sooner. Then the student introduced herself and was delighted to make the acquaintance. Leone Suirock, Princess of the Suirock Kingdom, arrived at the academy as an exchange student. She was also pleased to meet Mirai. The girl asked the princess what she thought of their country, as she should have become accustomed to it by now. Leone thanked her for her concern, and Alicia asked her to contact her if any difficulties arose. The princess suggested that her new acquaintance call her by her first name, which made the girl happy. For the rest of the day, she enjoyed a wonderful time, laughing and chatting with other students. The academy without art seemed like heaven. Mirai no longer felt stressed. Absolute was reading a book when Maria appeared in the room and announced that he had received a letter. After reading the contents, the young man ordered his maid to get ready for work. In the Kingdom of Liriana, in a town called Flower, the remnants of the Surok Kingdom's secret organization, Gileius, have gathered. The man said with displeasure that they couldn't just lose, so they needed to take revenge as quickly as possible. To delve a little deeper into history, a power struggle raged between organizations in the Kingdom of Surok. Having quickly won the battle, Gileius was forced to flee to other countries. The subordinate agreed with the boss, but did not understand what exactly needed to be done. Liriana, which was a good outcome. As for everything else, not long ago there were several thousand of them, but now there were only 50. The leader wasn't particularly pleased to say it, but they should join the Hayomo, a shadowy organization. Rumor had it they were under the protection of the noble Ark family. However, the nobles wouldn't protect them. If the Gileius wanted to protect their country, they would have to rely on their own strength. The boss lamented that the hired guide was unable to take them to the Ark family. Suddenly, one of his subordinates called out to him. He announced that a man had arrived who introduced himself as a member of the Ark family. The man began to worry about how many guards the man had, but to his surprise, the guest arrived alone. This representative was none other than the Absolute himself. The organization's members dropped to one knee before the young man. He didn't hesitate and immediately explained that he had business with them, as the group had already been interested in his family. The boss of Gileius said that his team harbored a grudge against the Surok Kingdom, so they would definitely be of use to him. Then the man remembered the presence of something that could certainly interest Ark. The young man was shown 2 twin sisters from a noble royal family. They could fetch a good price in the future. Absolute realized the organization was engaged in kidnapping. Meanwhile, the boss insisted they had other products that could bring profit to House Ark. The young man listened to all the proposals and explained that he was interested in what the gang leader had said. This brought him relief. However, the next moment, carnage began to unfold all around them. Ark delivered his verdict. They were all unworthy. The hero intended to teach those who continued to commit evil a lesson with his own hands. Therefore, quote, Gileius had no place in the Ark family. The fight continued outside, and the organization's boss asked Absolute why he'd done it. After all, they'd all come because they wanted to be allies. The boy replied that the Ark family wasn't involved in kidnapping people. From his perspective, it seemed stupid and low. The man couldn't believe it was him who said that. He thought the young man had it good, being able to use his powers to do whatever he wanted. It must have been a pleasant experience. The young man glared at his boss, which unnerved him. He wondered why. Ark's entire face and eyes oozed contempt for the gang leader. Unable to bear it, he begged them to kill him. The man didn't want him to look down on him. The smell of blood and the feeling of the ball piercing him made the boy feel as if he were no longer just evil, but a true outcast. He literally hated everything related to war, and especially actions like those committed by Gileius. Suddenly, one man took off his hood. It turned out to be Misto. He praised the gentleman for his excellent work. The man explained that, as he'd been told, he'd released the demon. Misto didn't understand who they were talking about. Ark explained that it was an entity that had penetrated past the Ark family's defenses and brought Gileius into the country. The hero saw a negotiator appearing to the side, and Misto himself must have heard about him too. A negotiator is a person who specializes in trade deals and shadow organizations and chooses missions based on profit. He had a skill that activated after combat, making him difficult to track. The field training event, where a huge number of monsters were released, resulted in the deaths of many people, including members of the Ark family. The hero asked Misto to take the girls with him. He planned to hand them over to the king later. Removing his glove, the young man stroked the head of one of the twins. Apparently, they were aristocrats from the Surok Kingdom, and this matter seemed strange. The guy picked up the sword again. His friend called out to him questioningly. Then Ark explained that he was going to ask a couple of questions to that man from the secret organization. The negotiator watched the events from the sidelines. He couldn't believe that Gileius had been destroyed by one person. His expectations were justified. The Ark family turned out to be dangerous. He began studying the paper, lamenting that no matter how much such a matter cost, it was better to refuse. The man was angry because his job was only about negotiations, but he was forced to move everyone to another country. The negotiator had a famous alias in the criminal underworld, willing to take any job for money. He was delighted to have witnessed Ark's abilities. This information could be worth a lot. The man put his mask back on and decided to leave quickly, but his way was blocked by a girl who appeared out of nowhere. It was a spirit, and a very strong one at that. The boy asked the reason for her appearance. Ark approached them, surprised that the negotiator knew about spirits. He said that the leader of one of the gangs was also a spirit summoner. The hero even speculated that they knew each other. The masked man became alarmed and took a step back from the newcomer. Ark introduced himself, as this was their first meeting. He pointed a finger at the negotiator. It was he, after all, who had brought the members of the Gileius organization to that place. The young man was irritated that the masked man had dared to harass him. The masked man felt ill, his chest squeezed by an invisible force. He couldn't utter a word, and the Absolute was indignant at being ignored. The young man wanted to intimidate the stranger, intending to kill him. The negotiator understood that things were bad for him. If things continued like this, he could indeed be destroyed. He tried to calm himself down enough to try to escape. The next moment, the man called for teleport. But nothing happened. The guy thought that his skill did not activate. He continued to make the call, but soon Ark's patience ran out. He cursed at the man, and at that moment, the mask cracked. The Absolute was oozing with successful rage. The negotiator had crossed the line by continuing to ignore him. Half the mask finally fell off, revealing the boy's terrified face. He wondered how the hero had managed to do it. Ark explained that he had an item capable of suppressing skills. It was a special item, created by Liriana at the height of her technology. The assassination attempt on a famous hero of the past prompted the country to create it. The Absolute obtained it through negotiations with the king. For him, efficiency was the main thing. He had no intention of calmly allowing everyone to watch everything from the sidelines, and he had no intention of letting the negotiator go. There were many things that Ark wanted to ask the boy about. One such question was the masked man's intention to unleash a large number of demons during the Liriana Academy field training. The hero placed his hand on his shoulder, and the negotiator felt as if he were struck by electricity. The boy was starting to panic. Only those involved should have known. Ark was indeed well informed, and all those mentioned were also kept secret. To discover this intention, a multitude of information resources were required. The young man realized he had misjudged his enemy's strength, which could only spell his end. Having tried his last chance, he began to flee. The only thing that kept swirling around in his head was that he didn't want to die. Turning around, the boy saw the Absolute rapidly approaching. He felt as if his pursuer was toying with him. Soon, his escape was interrupted by a cliff. The hero's ominous voice could be heard behind him, intent on ending everything. The negotiator knew the stakes were too high. The next moment, he was kicked in the stomach. It literally knocked the soul out of him. The young man looked at his defeated enemy with displeasure. He read that it was impossible to buy life with money. In the basement of Ark's house, the former negotiator sat tied to a chair with a bag over his head. Ark tried to wake him, but he was surprisingly stubborn. The hero didn't expect his guest to have such a high level of endurance. However, everything had its limits. Absolute was trying to achieve just that. He jabbed the negotiator and asked who the client was. The guy cracked pretty quickly, revealing Saint Eliza. But the hero had a hard time believing it. He understood that the girl couldn't have carried out such a plan alone. After all, she was only 15 years old. There were likely others involved, those who planned it and those who carried it out. In the church, Saint Eliza reported that everything was going well. The brainwashing of the monsters, received from the negotiator, was complete. All events went strictly according to plan. The cardinal agreed with her. Nymeria greatly valued the cooperation in the operation to defeat the Ark family. Michael Liriana, however, believed there was no need for gratitude, since they were friends. He was already pleased that they could count on him. Then he asked the saint about the matter with the contract, whether everything was all right with it. The girl responded positively. As soon as the operation was completed, she promised the former prince her support in returning to the throne. The group wanted to enjoy Ark while they could. Meanwhile, the hero was actively pondering who could be behind all this. There was talk in Class A after Hero got out of control. The saint insisted she had nothing to reproach herself for. However, Ark insisted that she had used the instigation skill on the Baron to deliberately provoke him into a rage. Eliza continued to dismiss it, calling it a terrible accusation. She insisted that even if it had been her doing, the young man still had no evidence. It would have been possible to find evidence using magic, but the hero knew that her skill was special, so nothing could be done with it. The saint's skill of incitement affected the human brain, provoking action. What was unseen could not be proven. She was flattered by Ark's confidence, as if he knew of her abilities. She wondered what he would do if there was no proof. The Absolute had no choice but to give in to her and retreat. But she had made an enemy of him, so sooner or later she would pay for it. The boy pondered the murder of the hero he had witnessed with his own eyes. At that moment he sensed clear malice on the part of the saint. Apparently, the church was behind everything. In the original, the saint was a naive church girl, ignorant of the world. However, it's possible she was hiding her true nature. She made a good actress. The professor allowed the students to take their seats. Ark heard about the field exercise and perked up his ears. The next week, all first-year students would be split into groups and sent into the forest in the southern part of the kingdom to hunt monsters. The deadline was 3 days. Progress will be determined by rank and the number of trophies obtained from monsters. This was essentially a practical exam, meaning the group needed someone who could handle the obstacles. The hero was surprised that hunting dangerous monsters was allowed. Toto explained that even the weakest monsters could pose a serious threat if there were many of them, so the man wished all the students well. The hero frowned. Time was running out and he needed to hurry. Walking down the hallway, Absolute thought hard that perhaps the church's target wasn't Art, but himself, or even the entire Ark building. But then he dismissed the thought. After all, in the original, Christina had died, so everything was vague. Vol was furious with the newcomer, who could even allow him to clean. She'd instructed him to work hard, and then he'd be sure to achieve results. The coordinator understood everything, but asked the maid not to say anything bad anymore since he was still young. The maid noticed the gentleman and greeted him joyfully. She also explained that the new guy turned out to be quite convenient. She was able to move between the mansion and the academy, so she was able to cope with her work. The hero stroked her head, then placed his hand on the young man's back, and called him to prepare for the upcoming exam. The students arrived at the appointed place. Ark frowned again. Maria noticed that the gentleman had a gloomy face, but he asked her not to pay attention. Next, everyone was told to form groups. Routes through the forest had been predetermined by the instructors to avoid problems. Each group was to follow the designated path. The royal faction group led by Michael, the church faction group led by Eliza, the girls faction group led by Alicia, the aristocratic faction group along with Christina, and the House of Ark faction group and Lady Leonie's. The girl asked the teacher to explain to her why she was put in a group with the Absolute. Teach explained that if something happened to the Duke's daughter, it would be a problem for the entire kingdom, so it was decided to take the test under the protection of the Ark House. They asked the 2 strongest disciples, members of the royal faction, to form this group. All this was done to protect Lady Leonie's. The girl understood everything and decided not to challenge this decision. The showdown with the monsters and the conversation with the saint promised to be interesting. In the original, Lady Leonie's was supposed to be part of the hero's party, but she ended up in reliable company. Absolute approached her to introduce himself. Along with Lady Cruella, she was glad to be in the same group with the Duke's daughter. The others followed their example. Misto supported Cruella's inspiration to help her in every possible way. The girl sent her friends off to do something, not just chat. This made Leonie's laugh. She found the new group very charming. Leonie Rog reciprocated their feelings. She wasn't very good at magic, but she was quite skilled with a sword and encouraged everyone to try. Absolute scolded the lady. She was worried about his attention, but he simply clarified that he was on her side. He asked her to follow his instructions and under no circumstances be left alone. The young man wanted to assign her guards so that if anything happened, they would protect her. Leonie had one comment. Despite it being his group, according to protocol, a maid was already assigned to it. She was worried whether there was any problem with this, and the guy reassured her. He understood that even so, they would succeed in the exam. They had enough fighting power. Christina asked Ark how he was doing. Was he really planning to compete with her group? The young man wasn't particularly happy about her arrival, but she continued to press him on whether he would compete in the number of monsters he killed. However, he replied that only if he wanted to. The girl feigned disappointment and clarified that if he continued to speak like that, she would be offended. Insulting and provoking was exactly the hero's style. Then, she turned her attention to Misto, since it concerned him too. He watched their argument and thought it might be his last conversation with Christina. The girl's magic was quite powerful, but he didn't understand why she died in the original. If the Absolute ended up on her team, they'd likely face danger. He interrupted his thoughts because this was a matter of justice, and the main priority was suppressing the monsters released by the church. If the hero didn't do this, all the monsters would attack his subordinates. However, the young man couldn't save everyone. The guy called Christina and told her that things were bad. The girl asked what might have happened and even joked about him asking for money. Ark decided it would take too long to explain, so he left all the questions to Misto. His friend, by the way, wasn't very happy about this. She realized that she had said too much and apologized. Misto asked her to stop talking like he was the one who abandoned her. The young man noticed Mr. Ark and hurried over. The hero asked if everything was all right. Chris answered affirmatively. Then the hero asked which route their group would take. The young man replied, Road E. The Absolute itself was on D, not that far apart, but if you think about it, there was a chance they'd been deliberately gathered and lured into the forest to wipe out the entire Ark faction. He couldn't let his guard down. Misto and Cruella had already entered into a fight with the goblins. The boy warned Lady to be careful. The girl understood everything and reacted instantly, directing the ice spear. She fought off the monsters in front, but they began to attack her from behind as well. Oriana managed to protect her and killed the goblins as soon as she stopped. Misto again screamed about the onset of new monsters. Leone also dealt well with the enemies, although they had not yet managed to enter deep, but there were already a lot of monsters. Ark stood to the side. Misto and the others wanted to gain experience, so they asked him to stay close, but he felt pressure from his comrades, as if they wanted him to fight too. The hero asked if they were tired. He was ready to relieve them if new enemies appeared. Cruella tried to dissuade him, saying they were weak and could handle them themselves. That's why she wanted the Absolute to let them prove themselves. Misto also supported her. Oriana considered it a trifle for them. The lady offered them a drink of her water. The hero frowned and folded his hands in front of him. His comrades were beginning to worry about him again. The Duke's daughter agreed to drink some water. The friends set up a small picnic for a short break. The water seemed very tasty to Leona. It had a refreshing taste, as if created by nature itself. Then she asked the girl what kind of water it was. Cruella called it lady water. The noblewoman had created this liquid using water magic, so it was entirely her own creation. Ark knew his friend was joking again, but it made a strong impression on the princess. She was surprised, but when she thought about it, it was possible. The group laughed at her reaction. Suddenly, Ark felt the presence of the spirit, and his eyes widened. A volley of light shot into the air. It was Chris's magic. Absolute told Misto he'd be gone for 15 minutes, and asked him to reinforce the barrier. Then he raced deeper into the forest. The boy realized that the place his master was heading to had a higher level of magic. Something must have happened there. The situation was apparently tense. The young man asked Orion to replenish his supplies of firewood and water, and Maria to keep an eye on the surrounding area. What worried him was that Ark moved without any hesitation, which could mean that he had information about the incident in advance. Leone called Browse to talk about something. The young man asked how she could help, and she explained that it was about Mr. Ark. She asked what he thought of him.